Happy to do so. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Jeff
Morning.
Meredith,
Here.
Cindy Yunkin, Porter Bennett,
Here.
Tim Kober,
Here.
Maggie Peterson, Mark Berry,
Here.
John Milanovich. Saw him earlier.
He's waving. Yep,
He's there. Dwayne Iverson, present.
He's waving.
Representative Larry Brewster, and Senator Shane Morajou. All right, that completes roll call for the board training. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Savannah. So next item, public comment. At this point, we'll entertain public comment on issues with board jurisdiction. The public comments surrounding the forensic mental health facility in Laurel, we'll break that into two groups, proponents and opponents. Each group will get a combined 15 minutes, after which we'll allow you to introduce yourself and state where you're from and whether you support or do not support the facility in that location. So let's begin with proponents. So if you are supporting the construction of the facility in Laurel, please raise your hand.
No hands, Mr. Chair. Yep, nothing.
All right. So opponents of the facility, please raise your hand and you'll have 15 minutes.
Looks like I have Elizabeth. I'm going to go ahead and mute her so she can speak.
Hi there. My name is Elizabeth Gill. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. This is my first Zoom meeting. I just have a statement that I'd like to read. My name is Elizabeth Gill. I'm a resident of Laurel, Montana. I'm here today representing Laurel Cared. It's a grassroots organization that we just created. It's a community advocates for responsible economic development. I'm also representing the thousands of Laurel residents who have not been heard in this process. The first thing I want to mention is on transparency and public records. This community has been denied the information it is legally entitled to. Community members submitted public records requests to understand how Laurel was selected for this facility. In response, the BOI sent a bill for about $3 grand, and that is not transparency. It's a barrier deliberately placed between the public and the public's business. On Dan Villa's conduct, Mr. Villa, your behavior throughout this process has demonstrated a blatant disregard for the community of Laurel. You made explicit promises to the Laurel City Council on December 9th on the public record that the council would hear about any buy-sell agreement before it was announced elsewhere. That promise was broken. The city learned about it from the press. You told this community that the BOI would follow every existing city resolution, ordinance, and process. And then you conducted private meetings at a construction company's offices and buildings to work around those very processes with no public notice. You coordinated directly with our CAO through informal channels, text messages, personal emails, requests for Zoom links, bypassing official city channels and treating a city employee as your personal liaison. And when the community tried to hold a public meeting with you in a venue large enough to accommodate the overwhelming response, BOI refused to come. Most troubling, there are credible accounts that you offered Laurel's Chief Administrative Officer, Kurt Markegard, a city employee paid by Laurel taxpayers, a beer in exchange for writing a letter in support of this facility. That is not how a state agency conducts itself. That is not how you earn the trust of a community. On the other board members present today, many of you have been copied on emails from Laurel residents raising these exact concerns. We have documented those correspondences, and not one of you has responded. Silence is a choice, and this community sees it. On the process itself, Hardin submitted a formal proposal. Miles City submitted a formal proposal. Both communities spent real time and money putting together the 7 required components. You toured their sites. You gave them a fair hearing. Laurel submitted no such proposal. What Laurel submitted was a letter written by our CAO, approved by our mayor in 3 minutes without a vote, without a public meeting, and without a single resident of Laurel, Montana being heard on this matter. And yet here we are. The board allowed other communities to invest in a competitive process while already planning to place the burden on Laurel. That's not a fair process, and it's not an ethical process. We are not asking this board to stop and listen. Oh, sorry, let me back up. We are asking this board to stop and listen to this community, not our CAO and not our mayor, because they have also not consulted us. The community has not been heard on this matter. We're watching, and we want on the record that we have been dismissed. A few notes. I guess I don't really have any. If you guys wanted to check out the website that our organization has put together, we have put together a full communications record of our like city government officials that we've received so far. They've been less than transparent with us also. I do request a couple of things. Yesterday in chat, I asked for a copy of the ethics agreement that you all signed so that I can compare that to the process which you have gone through to force this facility on Laurel next to my two daughters' school, where there are currently like 6 kindergarten classes and a bunch of other like first graders and second graders. I'm trying to be as professional as possible, but like, I'm just furious about the way that the government has let down the people that it is intended to serve. We've been completely ignored. And I'd like a statement. Like, I want to know why Dan offered her a beer. Why did you guys let these communities go spend money on a process when like you knew you weren't even going to consider their proposals? Like, it's disingenuous. And it's unacceptable of leadership. And that's all I got. I would just, appreciate maybe a statement or email back, just anything really. Thank you.
Thank you. With the remaining time here, are there any other opponents that would like to speak?
Savannah?
I'm not seeing anymore.
We
I
have
had
one waving.
Mona's
Oh,
waving.
I do see Mona. I will go ahead and unmute her. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I apologize. At the last moment, I got my 2 grandchildren, so I'll make this brief. So first of all, my name is Monterey Addix. I live at 102 8th Avenue in Laurel. I am opposed to the site location of the proposed forensic mental hospital. It is a correctional facility. The proposed site is located 459 yards from nearby homes, mine included, and our elementary school. It's also 459 yards away from this little guy's house. 1 mile is 1,760 yards. 459 yards is just slightly more than a quarter of a mile. The BOI oversees the finances of projects for the state of Montana, and I am respectfully asking you, the members of this board, to stop this process. There have been no public meetings regarding this facility. There has been no transparency from Dan Villa with the Laurel community. Dan Villa has only met privately with Dave Wagner, our mayor, and CEO Kurt Markegard. These 2 individuals have not provided the community with any pertinent information. I believe many Montana citizens understand the need for a forensic mental hospital on the eastern side of the state. The community of Laurel does not agree with the site that Mr. Villa has chosen. Our governor stated that this would not be forced upon any community that did not want it. So if somebody could please explain why it is being forced upon Laurel. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other opponents that would like to speak?
No hands, no. Oh. we've got a blank screen and Laura, are you trying to provide comment?
That would be a thumbs
Okay,
up.
that's a thumb, that, we'll take, that's a hand of some sort, so.
I've unmuted
Steph?
her, so, yep.
Okay,
Okay,
Thank you. Sorry.
that's okay.
Can't quite figure out how to raise my hand. Um, my name's Laura Kirschman. I am a homeowner and resident here in Laurel, Montana. And I just want to formally make my opposition to the forensic mental health facility that is being discussed of bringing here to Laurel known to you guys at the Board of Investments. I would echo everything that Elizabeth and Mana brought to light. This facility would be very close to my home. I live right next to the elementary school, so that is very concerning to myself, for the safety and security of my family, and the kids that go to that elementary school. There's a lot of concerns. I hope you guys could take the time to maybe look at our city council meetings that have been happening. A lot of people have spoken up and brought very valid concerns that this facility and the strain that it would put on Laurel. We just don't have the infrastructure to support such a facility. And I am very disheartened that we did not get the opportunity as a community and homeowners to speak on this topic before we got to this point. As I think Mana and Elizabeth, pointed out, the governor did say that public participation would be critical for this situation, and we don't feel like we have been awarded that opportunity. And now, we're kind of on the back end, which is very, very unfortunate. So I hope we can figure out a way to make sure that our voices are heard before any more movement is made. Because right now the city of Laurel is in uproar, and it's very sad to see. This is a town that is usually very strong, and comes together and is, I would say, calm typically, and that's not where we're at right now. We have only had two people communicating on the behalf of the town, Dave Wagner and Kurt Markegard, and that is not fair to the thousands of people that live here. So again, I firmly oppose this, and I just want that to be known. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Are there any additional opponents that would like to speak?
not seeing any.
Not seeing any more hands, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I believe each, if we don't have any others that have not been able to speak, the three community members who spoke stated their name and where they're from. So I feel at this point we can close the discussion for public comment on that topic. Is there public comment on any other issues besides the forensic mental health facility? Issues within board jurisdiction? All right, moving on to tab 9, board training, RVK. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here, and this board has often asked us as your general consultant, are we doing a good job, because we view over 200 boards on a regular basis and many others on an episodic basis. And I think the very existence of this training and the time that you're putting into it is kind of proof positive that when we respond, no, this board actually has its act together from a best practices point of view. I think that this is a classic example of why we feel that way, and we have over the years recommended changes in processes. We've investigated processes for you that you've directed us to look at, like due diligence recently for private investments. And we know that we report to you, and we always give you our best views as to what we see. If they're good, we say they're good. If we think there needs to be some consideration of change, we say that as well. I'm joined here by my colleague on our team, Paige, and she's going to carry the bulk of this presentation. But I may start off by talking a little bit about us, since there's been turnover on the board, and we typically don't get a lot of time to talk about how we view our mandate to you, and how we as your general consultant are changing over time. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, because it may sound like a commercial, and we're not up for renewal. There's nothing on the table other than to update you. As I said yesterday, we were extremely proud to go through a rare SEC exam and came out spotless, which that is such a rarity. It's terrific, but I think it should give you some confidence that we're running our firm in a highly trustworthy way, and a way in which our chief regulator, which is the SEC, could find no deficiencies in. Our firm, if I'm moving on to page 4, we are now over 40 years in continuous operation, serving clients like yourself. We spend a lot of time on our professionals. We have lots of things like advanced degrees and certifications and so on. But the thing that is most remarkable about our firm versus the industry as a whole, but particularly the major firms, of which we are one, I believe by various measures, we're the 4th largest in the US, and we now have foreign clients in Asia, South America, and the Middle East, is that we have strictly stayed as an advisor to you. We don't create investment products that we then might market to you. We think that's a conflict. We don't manage money because we think that presents a conflict, being an advisor and a money manager at the same time. So we have opted to stay strictly in our lane, and it has resulted in an unusual situation in which even our competitors will reveal things about their operations to us, sometimes under NDA, sometimes they don't even bother, because we tend to review their asset management efforts, like outsourced chief investment officer, and they actually essentially open their kimono and say, here's everything you need to know about our firm, because we represent always asset owners like yourselves. We're always sit on your side of the table. So in many ways, we're kind of an anomaly in the business, the way the investment consulting industry has moved. And we like it that way. We deliberately chose this path, and it has provided us with some challenges, because we don't manage money, and that can be, if you're successful at it, profitable. But it also has given us great advantages in terms of the kind of trust and the assignments that we get across the country that essentially involve sensitive situations. So we're kind of proud of that. Our employee count has slowed in its growth. You should not take that as a sign that our business is slowing. You should take that as a sign that we're investing heavily in technology inside the firm, whether it's databases, whether it's modeling capabilities, whether it's the increasing use of AI inside the firm to make our professionals more efficient. We've been able to actually grow our client count, and for the time being anyway, not have to grow our employee count. So if I could turn to page 5 for a moment, one of the things, and your staff, I think, would agree with this, just as recently as a couple of days ago, one of your private equity folks emailed us for a little bit of help and consultation, even though from a technical point of view, private equity is not in our scope of work. But investment consulting, from our point of view, means that we have to provide direct access to our subject matter experts. We don't want everything to be translated through Paige's view, my view, Becky's view, and we've seen. We want to make sure that your staff also can see around us and talk to the same subject matter experts that we talk to when we prepare for meetings. The other thing that's interesting about our firm is that the industry has had a massive amount of consolidation. Many firms that in our industry have been bought by either asset managers, by insurance companies, by other types of providers, or merged together in themselves. We have had remarkable organizational stability. We've not bought anybody. We've not been interested in selling to anybody. And in fact, we've put in our employee shareholder bylaws some significant inhibitions to the sale of the firm. And so what you see and what you have seen way back when you first brought us on board is still exactly who we are. We're just bigger and we have more services and so on. So with that,
Hey, Jim,
yeah.
sorry, Jim. This would be a good time. Typically, how does not knowing like what you started with, hey, we're not under review, and thank goodness you're, yeah, I mean, that's awesome. How do you typically, not knowing it and not having looked at the contract or the relationship in that, how do you guys it's typically a consulting relationship. Is it basis points on the assets under advisement, or is it a straight, and let's not talk specifically because, you know, I think that's something I'll touch base with Dan and learn more exactly, but how do you guys typically manage your relationship that way?
Well,
And forgive me for not knowing. I should
no,
know.
no, no, no.
I
There's
don't.
nothing to forgive. I don't know if Dan or John, you want to talk about the contract terms in terms of it's a fixed price. It's known.
Okay.
And so, you know, it's a situation, by the way, it is the majority of the relationships that we have, the same contract structure. Each client can vary depending on the services that they have us under contract for. Some of us have under a scope of work that covers all of their asset classes. Some of them, typically the general consulting work, and some of the asset classes, and some of our large clients, say like the state of New York, which is almost as big as CalPERS. They'll have a specialist consultant for almost anything you can think of. And we tend to be this sort of the ramrod that pulls everything together. So in that kind of arrangement, John, not to go too deeply into it, we take scope risk because we rarely say no. Dan, have we ever said no to anything that you've asked us to do?
You've advised against certain things, but
Yeah, well, that's true.
no, the general consultant position is there. There will be times when we have special endeavors, like when we did the private equity deep dive and the audit, so to speak, of our processes, where we'll engage beyond the sort of general consulting role. But that's a very case by case and pretty specific task order. I'd put it almost in the task order type provisions, which is actually specifically called out in the contract that we can do that.
It is.
So we don't need to repaper anything where it's like, you know, hey, it's all kind of, that's all spelled out. So that's great.
I don't think we've ever had a contract dispute.
Never.
And,
That's great.
not even a small one. And I think that speaks well for sort of the sober relationship between us when something truly unusual has occurred, like you have a legislative requirement to do the deep dive on your due diligence on privates. Because we have a good reputation for being objective and independent, you said, well, that's not in our contract. We didn't envision that, but we need you to do it because you are who you are and you know what you're doing. And so we constructed something separate. That happens, I don't know, once every 3 or 4 years, maybe. So there've been a number of those over the years, but and they've all been mutually, I think, beneficial both to us and to the needs of the board. The other thing.
Thank you. That's
Go
great.
ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. Forgive me for interrupting, but thank you. Thank you for your description itself. That's one thing I never kind of, you're going through it, it's pretty incredible that you guys are a great firm, and the size and the growth, and congratulations on being top 5. It's amazing. And good to hear. I just kind of wanted to know, so what does that relationship look like officially? And that's great to hear. Thank you.
Well, the other official part of it, which is important from a fiduciary point of view, which I'll have Paige take over on page 8, but I want to start page 8 by saying, as I said yesterday several times, we work for this board. We do not work for Dan or for John or for any member of your staff. And I must say your staff has been remarkable in respecting our independence with respect to who we ultimately report to. And but I think it's made for a stronger relationship. It almost comes up, I would say, fairly frequently over the course of any given year. You guys say, hey, we want to make sure that you're comfortable because you're going to say your piece in front of the board. And that recognition, I think, is really helpful. And I will say from long experience, oftentimes it's not good. But what it does do is that we hope it gives you the confidence that the work that we do with your staff behind the scene, that we are still remaining independent, and we're not afraid to have back and forth with John or with Dan about, do you really want to do this? Just like they say, gee, is that really the way you feel? And it's a great conversation, actually. And so I think that's important. But Paige, do you want to take over on page 8 and talk a little bit about how the team works? Because you see Becky, you see Paige, you see myself, but you often don't see all of the expertise that lies behind us. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the team uses that.
Sure. So the infographic shown in green in the center of the page here, this is really the core consulting team for the BOI. So like Jim said, Becky himself and me are the board-facing consultants that you're interfacing with in these board meeting settings. In addition to having us on this dedicated team, we do have a dedicated associate as well as an investment analyst, and then some support staff who helps us behind the scenes. So you have a dedicated performance reporting analyst who's the one who's actually putting together those performance reports that we bring forward to the board. The associate, Jacob, works with me a lot behind the scenes on developing the presentation materials that are coming forward to you. So we do tend to structure in this team environment. Obviously, we don't want you ever to feel like, if you can't get a hold of Jim or you can't get a hold of Becky, that you have no one at RVK who you're able to reach out to. And we found that this is a really effective way to make sure that we're able to provide a really high level of client service that you look to and that you deserve. In addition to having the dedicated client service team, you see these gray boxes on the bottom of the page here. This is going from left to right. The manager research team, this is one of our largest departments at RVK. We do have dedicated asset class specialists who cover the broad spectrum of asset classes that you're invested in. And in addition to us as your consulting team interfacing with them, your staff does have direct access to these research professionals as well. If they ever are going through a search process or want to have a collaborative back and forth on best ideas in any of these spaces, they are a really helpful group at RVK. Going further to the right here, we do have other dedicated practice groups, the asset liability team, investment operations solutions group in particular is one that the BOI has engaged with in the past. They do
Frequently.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so your custodian is BNY Mellon. There's been points in time where there's been or not BNY Mellon, State Street. They'll sound the same after a while.
Paige got here from another client meeting in California and arrived at 10:30 last night, got up at 6 this morning. So
Drinking coffee,
So So it's interesting. I apologize, Paige. Just a quick question here.
Sure.
And Jim, I didn't quite understand. I've always kind of thought that you're supportive of us, and that you ultimately you're obviously you respond to us, but that the relationship really is through the forgive me for not quite connecting the dots, that the relationship is actually direct with the board and not direct with the staff, so to speak. So, and obviously you're in direct communication with the staff, but as a entity, I guess now I'm wondering, like, if I have a question, should I be talking? I mean, obviously, I talk to John, or I send him a note, or Dan and I send him a note, but am I supposed, if I have a question, are you my resources directly, and obviously the first step for me would be, of course, the staff, but there may be a topic where I'm interested in something. Do I reach out to you directly, or how does that help walk me through that from a relationship standpoint?
The answer is no. We don't work for the individual board members. We work for the board as an entity. And
Okay.
so while as a courtesy from time to time when there's an issue, as I did yesterday, we'll offer to do a one-on-one note or a conversation to help a board member. But from the point of view of directing our work, that needs to come from the chair or the executive director speaking for the board or the staff. And when you think about it, that makes sense. I mean, no advisor can take on 9 different individuals.
Yeah, no, of course, sure.
And we don't want to work at cross purposes with the majority of the board. If 7 or 8 members of the board want to go in one direction, we can and want to hear sort of what the opposing view or different view might be. Our obligation is to help the board understand that, but not to be a proponent of it. We serve the board as a whole. And that's the way the contract is written.
Well,
And that's
I get that,
our
but
fiduciary duty lies to the entity, not to the individuals.
sure, that makes perfect sense. But the board as a whole is not. If someone had a question, for example, not a theory, not a policy question, or a statement of, hey, I think we should be doing this or doing that, but more of a question. It's kind of cumbersome. It makes. I wasn't quite here. I was when you described what you described 2 pages ago of this relationship, it then led me to believe, oh, it's good. We've got a backup person to reach out to in case we do have a question on an item. And that is not something that as a group, it would be difficult to say, okay, listen, I'd like to learn more about, for example, the index or whatever we're using as an example, or it might be an allocation, or it might be whatever. It would be cumbersome to then, send an email to every board member and go, okay, as a board, do we want to, how, do you get what I'm saying? Like there's a balance there. And I was just, it led me to believe, when you were saying, really you guys work for us, and you have these resources for us. Is that, how does that officially work? And I guess what you're saying is officially it goes through Dan and John. But then that's the question
or the chair of the board.
Sorry, Jeff, of course, yes.
Yeah, it makes eminent sense from a contract point of view, from an advisory point of view, that we work for the entity. But how you communicate that to us is really your choice. It can be directions that you all funnel through Dan or through the chair or through John. All we want to do is to make sure that if we get an assignment to do work, that it's the board that is coming from the board as a whole, or the leadership of the board speaking for the board. That's why the chair's position. That's why there is a chair's position in the first place.
Assignment of work, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, but I just want to clarify. So assignment of work would be, if someone had I mean, my first call would be to John or Dan. It always, unfortunately for Dan, it always is Dan, Dan typically. But if I had a performance question, is like contacting the performance analyst, is that a change in assignment of work? If it is, if that, then that makes sense that you should go through I just want to clarify that so that if I did have a question, am I reaching, it makes logical sense there. And it sounds like what you're saying is, yeah, you would go, although those resources are there for the board, it's the board as an entity, and it probably best, to reach out first to the Dan or to John and have them reach out to the entity if there's still a question.
I can only say that some boards have adopted a behavioral policy that they actually put down in writing in many cases, and that is it is reasonable for an individual board member to reach out with a question, but they always have to CC the board chair or the executive director. We're not telling you have to adopt a policy like that, but we have a policy.
No, that would make sense.
But we have a policy inside our own team that if someone from a client should reach around Becky, Paige, or I into the rest of the team, that team member exposes that communication to all of us. And it is always best to communicate through what we call the team email. Every client has an RVK team email, which alerts the entire team to either an assignment that has come from John or Dan or from the chair, or a question that involves clarification. Because the moment you start sort of going around the folks that are charged with interacting with you and providing you with advice on the spot, down, for example, to say a very junior person on our team that does performance reporting, we might connect you with that person. We have connected staff with that person on a regular basis. But it never occurs without the full knowledge of your advisory team from RVK. I hope that's responsive, John.
Yeah, it is. It's more of it's illuminating to me that there's that resource is more of the question. And truthfully, again, it's my first go-to if I have a question is usually Dan directly or John directly. And it's good to know that there's a team email where if I did have a question or a board member had a question, if we CC'd. But again, we don't want it's got to be within the realm of scope and the realm of the work as well. And so, I guess I'm just clarifying, the education is awesome. And so like walking through the relationship with you, it's good to actually hear, okay, well, what is that relationship on a real level, how that works. And so those are kind of where I'm coming from with question wise. So thank you for that. And if I'm not being clear there either, I'm fully getting like if there was a question, it should be CC'd with Jeff absolutely and the team, and I think obviously our first outreach is to John or Dan.
Well, again, that's how the board conducts its business internally and what community, that's your business.
Yeah.
We can tell you what some other boards do and some other boards don't do, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. But we will tell you how best we can serve you. And that is using the team email and making sure that, the leadership of our team, which is Paige, Becky, and myself, are aware of what you're asking us to do.
What is that team email, just so that we know?
It is.
I'll forward it to you, John.
Okay. Oh yeah, good idea. Thank you. Yeah, got it.
Computer
Appreciate
knows
that.
it, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's the correct answer. Thank you.
So if I could move on to page 9 and 10, you had a fiduciary presentation yesterday from your attorney, and I will say, number one, they should be your first choice in terms of fiduciary questions, because ultimately defining what fiduciary behavior is and defining a breach of fiduciary behavior is a legal question. We're not attorneys. But we do observe how, as a matter of business conduct, trustees in all types of funds, whether it's endowments, whether it's any place where the trustees are in charge of the protection and oversight of someone else's money. We have a great vision into how they execute that responsibility. And on page 10, on page 9, we talk a little bit about what we observe in Montana Constitution and statutes. And in page 10, we talk about how we try to essentially support you in the conduct of your fiduciary duty. And we have a vested interest in doing so because we also have fiduciary duty. It's in our contract. In fact, I don't know that we have ever accepted a contract where we're not a named fiduciary. Unless it was for some small technical short-term project for someone who is not an ongoing client. So if you look at page 10, what you can see is here are some of the things that we observe that are the business expressions of trustees who execute fiduciary duty. Whether they understand that from your internal attorney, whether you understand that from presentations you get episodically from fiduciary counsel, or they're in some cases, some boards that we have, I'd say minority, actually have under contract access to a fiduciary counsel. Fiduciary counsel is a very small but specialized slice of the legal universe. So I don't want to go into all of these, but if you look at page 10, you can recognize everything that's in these bubbles as things that we try to support you on. The training, for example, this is a perfect example of that. But documenting decisions, we are always prepared and always recommend that you get formal documents from us on our letterhead that gives you the advice so that if anybody questions whether or not you accessed expertise, it's there in writing in spades. We help you with the IPS for the same reason, and we give you access to all the expertise that we have, and we sometimes will recommend expertise that we don't have. So for example, when you first started using CEM, we were involved in that decision and brought up the fact that this is a firm that does this. It's one of the rare firms that does the work that they do for you. And so we're not afraid to actually connect you with other experts. So with that, Paige, you want to talk a little bit about our public fund? This came up, our public fund survey. This came up yesterday in terms of what other public funds are doing. And we've often said, be careful of looking at what peers are doing because peers are not you. You are you. You are unique and distinct in many, many ways. There are lots of similarities, but it is always useful to see what, generally speaking, peers, when I say generally, I mean generally peers, are doing and compare it to what you're doing, not to copy them, but just be informed as to what's happening out there with trustees and CIOs and executive directors who are grappling with some of the same problems you are. So Paige, you want to take over on page 12 so that I can have some coffee?
Sure. Yeah, I'm starting on page 12 here. I mean, you've heard this from Becky, Jim, and myself time and time again, but when we're looking at metrics of success for the BOI, right, the hierarchy we're going back to is how are you doing relative to your own actuarial hurdle that you've set? How are you doing relative to the stated benchmarks that we've agreed on ahead of time? And really the least important metric that we have available is the peer comparison. Again, because everyone is structured a little bit differently, everyone has a little bit of a different financial position. That being said, it is helpful to see what is going on and staying abreast of the trends in the asset allocation world. So RVK does offer, this is a proprietary service that we do. We collect data from a ton of public funds out there, and we aggregate this data into a semi-annual report called our public fund report. We've been publishing this report twice a year for 30 years now. So we have been able to develop a really nice history of trends over time for how are these public funds allocating across that time horizon. We're showing you the data here from our December 31st, 2024 report that contains 67 public funds in the universe. And looking at the notable asset allocation trends in this chart here in the bottom left of the page, you can see that there's been a slight decrease in the allocation to public equity. That's the blue shown in the bottom of the chart here. At the same time, there's been a small decrease in fixed income over this time period. And you can see that's been offset by a small increase to alternatives allocation. So things that are going to fall into alternatives are private equity, private credit, real estate, all those things that you have baked into your own portfolio. Again, this is the same trend that you've seen in your portfolio, right? And Jim probably talked about our capital market expectations to some degree yesterday. We will be bringing those updated forecasts to you in April, I believe. But again, in this environment where we've been moving into compressed really risk premia when we're looking at public assets, both on the equity and the fixed income side, there has been some attractive opportunities to move into the alternative space and offset those more traditional assets that plan sponsors have allocated to in the past.
Let me, we threw out a bit of jargon there, risk premium. What risk premium really means is the expected opportunity, the most likely opportunity to get returns for risk taken. When risk premia are compressed, what that means is that the expectation for taking risk is not zero, but it is diminished relative to other periods of time.
Question, Porter?
Why don't you proceed on to page 13, but to Paige's point, if you look back at the history of your asset allocation, doing things like adding real estate, adding private credit, making adjustments in your the way you approach private equity, all of these things are in the same vein as what we are seeing in public funds generally. You're not doing anything that is, wow, no one else is doing this, everybody else is doing the opposite. You are in the same trend, but that highway is like an 8-lane wide highway, and there's many different lanes to go down, and you have your own lane. So I'll stop there.
I just had another another kind of jargon question. You used actuarial hurdle. Is that something that we set up, or what is that?
Can I address that when we get to page 14? I'll hold that question because that's an excellent question.
I'll hold them honest. We'll come back to that, I promise.
Why don't you do 13 and then I'll
Sure.
discuss 14.
Yeah, so moving forward to page 13 here, this is really just breaking down within that alternatives bucket that we were just talking about. What do the trends look like for those individual asset classes? The main trend that I would call out here again is the introduction really of private credit to institutional portfolios such as yours. Private credit is I'm going to use air quotes, newer asset class. You know, it has not been around for as long as things like private equity and real estate. And that really has been the largest trend that we've seen over the last 5 years. Private credit continues to be an attractive asset class when we model it. Again, and just the diversification relative to the other alternative asset classes that you have implemented. You know, again, like Jim said, we're not trying to follow what everyone else is doing, but typically when we do see inflows into a particular asset class, it's for a good reason. And looking at your portfolio in particular, private credit has been very beneficial within your portfolio from an allocation perspective.
Also, from a liquidity perspective, you may recall yesterday that Thomas, I believe, we had a little back and forth about how the addition of private credit has offset somewhat the slowness of return of capital in private equity. So, you know, there have been benefits from it. And you might say, well, why didn't we do this 20 years ago? And the answer is it wasn't available 20 years ago. This is something that was really born in a major way by changes in the capital markets themselves after the great financial crisis. And that's why you see it as a new asset class, or at least sub-asset class that has emerged. Any other comments about page 13?
I was just gonna call out that you might have a question, hedge funds are shown here in orange. You do not have any hedge funds within your portfolio, so we have no need really to talk about that. However, I would say we have seen that's been the other area where there's been diminishing allocations to hedge funds. Allocators in general tend to be less excited about being in hedge funds than they used to be. So if anything, you're a little ahead of the curve there by looking to other areas in your portfolio for alternative allocations.
And
Jim,
sometimes it looks like people are investing less in real estate, which they are currently, but that decline in the real estate segment of this chart is in major way driven simply by the decline in the values of real estate.
Jim,
Yeah.
Jim,
Yes.
what would you say was the draw? Why did in the, I guess, 90s to early 2000s, hedge funds were like king? And is it because they traded sideways for a decade, or what has been what did you see as over time the driver of hedge funds not being? Is it just the alpha performance, the paying for that has not equaled success? I mean, what do you think has led to that decrease over time?
Good question, John. I don't think there's any one reason. One reason though has been that the public markets have
Sure.
been, public equity markets have been so rewarding relative to hedge funds that a lot of folks have said, why do I need hedge funds? And also there's been a search for other less correlated asset classes, such as you have with things like preferreds, high yield. You've searched for things to balance against equity risk in different buckets, and many other clients have as well. The other thing is that the number of hedge funds, because of the success you talked about in hedge funds prior to the GFC, the number of hedge funds and the amount of capital in them absolutely exploded. And hedge funds, by their nature, they're niche vehicles. They tend to focus on the relationship between, for example, currencies, or they focus on the relationship between the current market price and an expected buyout price if there's an announcement, event risk. And so the amount of capital that flowed into those segments really ballooned. And there's something called the weight of capital argument that isn't always true, but it's particularly true when the opportunities are segmented. And that is that they overwhelm the amount of opportunities and they arbitrage down the return. So there's no one explanation, but also the fees are high. This board took a hard look at about 15 years ago at hedge funds and opted to go in the direction that you went in. It proved to be a very good direction. So it is one of the things I talked about, the eight lane wide highway. You chose a lane that some other funds are in, but many other funds are not. There's a little bit of resurgence going on in the hedge fund world in terms of client interest. And it's largely because of concern over the very high equity valuations and the intensification of the search for things that might counterbalance or provide risk mitigation against a potential decline in the public equity markets. So
Yeah,
that's a long-winded answer, John, but that's it.
No, I knew you'd have the thank you. I appreciate that's a good education there.
So let's return to your question about the assumed rate of return. In Montana, you have a curious situation, which isn't totally unique, but it is unusual in this respect. One is that your legislature actually sets the contributions that are made to the pension plan. Am I right about that, Dan?
Yes.
And but at the same time, it is the job of the pension systems to say what is the appropriate level of contributions from an actuarial finance point of view that will move us to full funding in some reasonable period of time. Whether the state chooses to put more in, less in, fund it a different way, that's a separate question. But that calculation still needs to be done. And it is done by the actuary, and the actuary works for the pension plans, not for you.
So
Now-
can I interrupt?
Yeah,
For a second, Jim? So, in setting that period of time to be fully funded, is that set in law or is that set by the actuary?
So I'll get in the Wayback Machine. 1994, the people of Montana amended the Constitution with Article 8, Section 15, that says the public pension systems shall be funded on an actuarially sound basis, and that all of the assets cannot be encumbered or diverted. Fast forward to early 2000s, the pension plans are overfunded. They're over 100% funded. At that point in time, the legislature moved the guaranteed annual benefit adjustment, or the GABA, from 1.5% up to 3%. So basically doubling the retirement benefit growth model on a go-forward basis for all past and future enrollees in the PERS system. Get to 2000.
Mistake number one.
I don't know.
Wow. Can you repeat that, Dan? Because I had no knowledge of that. I mean, that's news. That's amazing. So we were overfunded in 2000.
In 2000, the state of Montana pension systems were overfunded.
Amazing.
Then 2001 happened. So they look at the paper and they show, okay, we have excess benefit, or we have excess funding. We can therefore increase benefits. And the legislature and the governor at the time decided that the benefits would increase. Then 2001 happened, and that changed a lot of the dynamics. And when you change a benefit in the pension systems, it's for everybody that's currently enrolled and going forward until the statute is revised, and that's a contract right under that Article 8, Section 15 of the Constitution. So you can't go reach back in and say, well, you were at 3%, now we're taking you back to 1.5%. So everybody in the system up until July 1 of 2007, when the legislature moved PERS back to 1.5% GABA, is at a 3% benefit adjustment going forward. In that same amount of time, our rate of return, that Article 8, Section 15, vesting the actuarial rate of return determination with the pension boards, they were at 7.85% rate of return expectation. That has moved down over the years to the current 7.3. And it's on their side a couple of factors. One, there's additional contributions from the employers and supplemental contributions from the state. So every year there's a cash infusion. It used to be coal tax trust. It is now general fund dollars, because back in the 2015, 2016 range, the rating agencies called some guy who was in charge of the state budget and said, we don't believe coal revenues will be going on a go forward basis. You need to switch this revenue stream or you're going to get a downgrade. So we had to switch that from coal to general fund. It's the same effect, but it's the dollars changed. But then we also in 2013 put in a variable guaranteed annual benefit adjustment for the teachers' retirement system and the PERS system. So now if you join the system after July 1, 2013, your benefit is based on the funded ratio of the pensions themselves. So if you're at if the state is at 90% funded in PERS and TRS, you get the full 1.5% GABA. If it's not, you get some reduced GABA from that 1.5% based on the actual funded ratio. So the tripartite here is we go make as much as we can. The pension system set the actuarial hurdle based on the contributions that the legislature has established, all of the employers and employees set. And then the legislature looks at the interaction between the two and where our funded ratios are to fulfill the obligations under Article 8, Section 15.
Okay, did you answer my question? Is the,
That's the history. We're in training, so I'm giving you some of the history.
So.
Yeah,
so-
that's super helpful. Seriously, that was really awesome.
but is the period of time to be fully funded? The
That
actual-
is established by statute by the pension system, or that is established by statute by the legislature, which is currently 30-year amortization.
In law. then.
That is in law.
Okay.
And there's been a couple of discussions about, should we lower that? Should we raise that? The logic for why the legislature originally set it at 30 years is that's the career. So if you're looking at a 30-year working career, sort of that rule of 80, age 50 plus years of experience gets you to full benefit at 80 combined years. That's where that 30 comes from. So you don't get, why would we calculate full amortization off of less than a full working career and a full benefit structure?
Thank you.
Yep.
So, so in the process that Dan just described as it stands today, the actuary will talk to the pension board. They will look, as Dan said, at the contribution stream that appears to be in statute, that policy. As part of their calculation as to where the funded status of each pension plan is. But they will also have to make an assessment of what they believe the return on the assets for that pension plan will be. So they consult with John, but it is their decision. But that is a key defining moment, and that is the actuarial hurdle. You don't control it. And I would say, as a matter of best practice, you are not obligated to do everything under the sun to try to meet it if you feel in your fiduciary duty that the circumstances are in the investment market, in the investment environment, that you need to protect the assets that are already there. This is your judgment. And there are times when you may choose to say, I know that the actuary is expecting this, but our sense of duty over protecting the assets that are in our trust means that right now, if our expected return for our asset allocation is lower, so be it for the time being. That is within your purview. But it does provide an interesting back and forth between you and the pension plan's actuary. So that brings us to page 14. So the actuaries in the world, generally speaking, and this is for the US, have been recommending to their pension boards on an ongoing basis for the last 15 years, lower and lower assumed rates of return as part of their calculation for what contributions would take them to full funding, say at 30 years. There are plans that have a 20-year horizon target. It varies by plan. And what you see here is that if you look at the chart on page 14, the sort of almost all of the examples are between 6.5% and 7%. There are a handful of funds that are higher. There's a couple of funds that are lower, but not very many. So the sweet spot right now in terms of pension boards' assessment of the contributions that they are assuming when they say what is the appropriate level or the actuarially required contribution level, it ranges between 6.5% and 7%, roughly. It captures most of the universe. You're kind of toward the top end of that range and have been for quite a few years. Fortunately, as I pointed out yesterday, this board has had an investment strategy that has produced returns over that very long period of time that have actually exceeded even that higher rate. But it is a fact that your pension boards are basing their contribution hopes and aspirations, because we know the legislature has the last word, on a rate of return that is higher than most other pension plans in the US are expecting. So when we say actuarial hurdle, that's what we're talking about here. we're talking about the expectation that the pension board's actuary has when they say, what are the contributions that are going to be required to get us to full funding in 30 years? Is that helpful to you? Because it is a little bit.
That's very helpful.
Okay, great.
So, you know, the bottom line, you've lowered the expected return. Then you're going back and collecting it from general fund. Somebody's gotta pay it.
There's 4 places the state of Montana can get money. Taxes, fees, assessments, or us. That's it. So the strategy that the state has had since at least 2013 is maximize BOI contributions so that you don't have to have those additional tax fee assessments, or in the case of the pension system, employee contributions as well. The rate of return, biggest driver of the health of the system overall, but there's a lot of mitigating factors in there. So there's a lot of triggers on the north side and the south side of 20 to 25 years built into statute that the fundamental shift that happened from the early 2000s to 2013 is there won't be any benefit enhancements on a go-forward basis. On a go-forward basis, it is employer contributions, taxpayer contributions, state general fund contributions will come down first. Then you can start having a conversation about benefit adjustments. But you're right, it's anything we don't produce, it's coming out of a paycheck, which technically you're not supposed to be able to do retroactively. So if you're in the system under a contract right, increasing that employee contribution technically isn't allowed. We were able to do so on a one-time basis in 13.
So John, I have a question for you. Have you ever felt pressed to meet the expected rate of return that the pension plans give you, or have you been?
No.
With what they?
I mean, I don't know if you recall or not, Mark, but I mean, there's certainly been a lot of times when we go through the MVO analysis and we will look at that and we come out with an expected return of 6.9%, over some period of time. That's actually quite frequent, I would say, when we do that. Now, we've always managed to beat that because MVO doesn't really account for a lot of different, factors. We've certainly gotten questions over that over the years of like, hey, that doesn't hit the 7.3. And to Jim's point, which is exactly right, what we don't want to do is say, well, in order to hit our 7.3, we'd have to change our asset allocation. We would have to risk up. We would have to go into, far riskier assets and we could, theoretically get there at that point. But, oh, by the way, when we sort of do our analysis, there's only a 25% chance we get there and there's a 75% chance that we blow ourselves up. And it's like, well, okay, we're not going to do that, right? Because that's how we dig ourselves a much deeper hole. And I think fundamentally this board, yourselves and prior board members have always understood that dynamic very well. And, Dan gave a fantastic overview and knows much better than me all of the ins and outs in state government. But, it's been very meaningful over the years where, we came off a period of, the legislature increased the employer contribution 0.1% a year for 10 years, and that was a permanent increase. You'll remember this last session, they did it again, and it's 0.1% a year for the next 20 years, to, up to 2%. I mean, those are kind of sound like small numbers in the scheme of things, but when you put that, and I haven't seen it yet because they haven't done it, I don't think, for that, latest iteration, but those are meaningful when the actuary goes to put those back in there and you get that 30-year time frame and you get to have a little bit more incremental contributions. It makes a difference over a long period of time. So, and we've continued, well, we have not, the PERS, TRS boards have continued to move that actuarial hurdle down, and partly because we've had good returns in excess of the hurdle, and partly because of some of the things that the legislature's done. And I feel pretty good about, where we're at on a go forward basis here at this point.
And I think that number likely continues to come down over time, hopefully, knock on wood.
So I guess that's a little bit of the question I had. One was, if the pension exceeds the 30 years, what would happen? You kind of answered, there would be additional contributions. And then it seems like we kind of are going back and forth on the actual actuarial rate of return, whether it's set based on the expectations of the performance of the assets in the plan, or it's massaged by the PERS at the end of the day to
Yeah.
kind of pick the number that they want.
I'm hearing it's massaged.
So is it kind of, here's the expectation, then it's kind of massaged to a degree?
That's not a foolish question, because if in all of these situations where we've seen boards, with the advice of their actuary, move the expected rate of return down, the moment you do it, you actually lower the funded ratio.
Yeah.
Because you have to adjust upward contributions, and you're assuming less contribution coming in from investments. Not zero, just a little bit less. But as John pointed out, a little bit less over 30 years actually is a big number. And so there's a human reluctance to do that, because they're basically taking a number that they're responsible for and actually making it worse in order to, over the long run, make it better. And that's a tough thing to do.
The rate of return is the biggest driver, but the downstream effects of that, for instance, there was big updates to the mortality tables in the last few years. I mean, COVID did have an impact on the mortality tables and how long people will be living and how long those benefits will be paid. So that enters into it. There's also an element of, is prior performance a predictor of future success? For those pension funds that have an investment strategy that is either not meeting their expectations, and Jim weigh in, but as I see it, that's usually a case of the funded ratio is so low, they're bleeding out corpus at a rate that exceeds what they can grow the assets by. That changes what your expected rate of return can be. Well, from a funded ratio, we're top quartile. So we're not facing those, I'll throw a state that's in the news, Kentucky. They're bleeding corpus on a regular basis. So their expected rate of return has to be either through the roof and risk up and totally unachievable, or down at a, bond rate, risk-free rate, as I think it's now called in the actuarial sciences, that never get them to funded ratio anyway. They just keep bleeding corpus.
And
So
when Dan says bleeding corpus, what he means is that a significant chunk of the assets in place in any given year have to go out the door. So they have to be invested short. Where you saw yesterday, the yield curve, just to take fixed income, for example, the shorter you get, the lower the return is. And this is the process that Dan is talking about when you are very poorly funded, or more accurately, when you're very poorly funded and you have a very high payout ratio of your assets, it prevents you from investing in private equity, private real estate, even equity has to be constrained because it's so volatile. And what that does is it lowers the rate of return that is reasonable given, the cards that the investment arm has been dealt.
It's why we show you that one slide every quarter that shows, here's what the payouts were, here's what the increase in assets were over a long period of time. Are we paying out more or less than are our assets still growing? And, they're still growing at a significant rate. And that to me is kind of the bigger piece of it, as opposed to, well, what's the actual hurdle rate, et cetera, to all of your points. It's, it is smooth. The actuarial process is kind of a weird arcane, well, we're not going to give you full credit for what performance was this year, but we'll give it to you in 4 years. And it is this big smoothing thing, because it's a huge,
Which we mark-to-market
period
people
of time.
really don't like.
Yeah, so is what it is.
So I wanted to add a little bit to what Dan said about how Montana has coped with the situation from 1996 onward. There were many pension plans in the years 1998 to 2000, even into 2001, that raised benefits. The moment you raise benefits not just for that year, but for all the years going forward. It is a very big number. And if you do it and you don't put any dollars in, you immediately reduce the funded ratio. And you either amp up demands for investment contributions, which we know what happened in 2001 to 3. We had the tech telecom bust. The NASDAQ fell by 50%. It was almost the worst time. It seemed like a great time to raise benefits. Actually, it was the worst time. What has happened, each state, each municipality, each county that has a DB plan in the public realm has charted a different path to deal with what happened then and what happened during the GFC. So you have your path, which has some supplemental contributions from the general fund, previous to that, the coal fund. You've had special contributions that have come in on a one-off basis and so on. And you've done things like change the variable. Other states have given their legal structure, said, oh, well, we used to not charge employees anything. Now they're going to have to put 1% of their pay into their own pension plan. We've had situations where they have eliminated the COLA altogether because they could under that state's law and that state's constitution. Ohio is an example. And so, and some of them have gone out, like New Jersey and Illinois, and borrowed very large sums of money to put in the pension plan, but then they have to, of course, pay off the borrowing and the interest in it. So it really is a cost of the pension plan. So my point in saying this is that you are not alone in having that kind of history, but the way you have addressed it is a function of the levers that you had under your legal system, and what the court said here in Montana, and also your policy choices as to sort of where you would find money and what you would do. Because when you look at, again, your investment history has been a solid contributor. Now, past returns, no guarantee of future returns. And when April comes, we'll talk about how a sober look at future returns is probably appropriate at this point. But the point is that you chose one set of things to do to deal with that issue. Other states have chosen different paths and different combinations of ways to address it. So I'm sorry I dwelled too long on that, but it is yet another reason why we don't put a whole lot of weight on peer comparisons. Comparing you to Kentucky and saying your investment, performance is so superior almost does a disservice to Kentucky because they couldn't do your investment policy and investment strategy even if they wanted to. So I'll stop there. Paige, do we have anything to say about pages 15 and 16? If we do, why don't you say them?
I'll keep it really quick. On page 15, this is an excerpt from your performance report, just another peer comparison that we do conduct. The punchline is you look really, really similar to how your peers are allocated. There are some small differences. You have a little bit less in US fixed income and a little bit more in real estate than your peers in this particular peer group.
Now, that doesn't mean that that doesn't say, gee, you're really close to what other funds are doing. You're close to what the median fund is doing, but there's a distribution. So you're not close to any particular fund necessarily. And number two is, remember the discussion yesterday about how, in our judgment, in each of your asset classes, you might have the same amount of money invested in an asset class as, say, the median fund in this study, but you may do it with a conservative bent. So, whether it's real assets, whether it's high yield, whether it's the use of preferreds, your path doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly the same simply because your asset allocation looks similar. Is that a fair assessment, John?
Yeah, these are pretty high level, broad categories.
So, Paige, how do you feel about talking about best practices? Because that's the easy one. This board has a hell of a lot of best practices. So
Sure.
why don't you do that while I kick
Page
back
18.
and relax?
So again, I think this is just a really nice overview of the framework under which you're currently operating. If you go down these key elements that are shown on the left-hand side of this slide on page 18, you'll recognize this is essentially the investment-related agenda items that are being brought forward to the board on an annual basis. So there is a cadence in which we're reviewing these topics and bringing these investment items forward to the board. So to run through them at a high level, the first being asked allocation. You'll hear this out of our mouths time and time again, that asked allocation is the single most important decision that you can make as a board as it relates to the success of your investment program. Currently, you are going through the asked allocation review process on an annual basis. As a reminder of that process, the asked allocation review does kick off as a collaborative process between RVK and your investment staff. We go through an annual onsite to go through the current portfolio, kick the tires on potential portfolios, what changes are coming through in the capital markets that we should all be talking about, and really do some behind the scenes work before that review is brought forward to the board on an annual basis. When you're looking at that review for the first time, it's more of a, here's the background, here's what we've gone through, and then there is a second reading typically with the board, at which point in time you're either reaffirming the current asked allocation targets or looking to approve a new asked allocation that's recommended by John and his team.
In that meeting, I wish every trustee could be a fly on the wall in that meeting, because it's really an interesting meeting because we bring certain points of view to the table. John, as the CIO, brings certain points of view to the table, and his individual asset class officers bring different points of view to the table, even different than John's. It is a fascinatingly robust conversation. I actually love it, and it's already been scheduled for this year.
Yeah, so moving on from the asked allocation, a lot of this, I would just put it in the lens of when you're looking at it as like, this is how to have really good governance and make sure that you're covering your bases as a board by having a documented process that you're going through on an annual basis. And also by having documented things like your investment policy, right? So you have investment policies that are maintained for each of the funds. That's really the governing document outlining the roles and responsibilities for all the parties involved, including yourselves, and outlining really these general processes that we're going through so that if there ever is a question on why a decision has been made, you have that as the governing document to go back to that's guiding you. Again, the philosophies baked into those documents came out of this board and have been agreed upon by this broader group, as well as subject matter experts who are advising on best practices to have in place. Going on from there, investment performance and market environment being reviewed regularly. Again, as a fiduciary, it's part of your role to be up to date on what's happening with the funds under your purview, as well as what's going on in the broader markets. That's really where RVK and your staff step in to provide these investment updates. And again, while we're trying to, bring interesting content forward to you, we do work to try and make sure that we're bringing forward the themes that we think are most relevant to you, right? Because we don't want to sit up here and drone on and lose you by just talking about individual stocks.
Are you talking about me droning on?
I was not pointing any fingers.
You looked over this way and it made me nervous.
Yeah. So you have the reviews that are coming from RVK, obviously. You're getting also reviews from John and his asset class officers at each of the meetings. In addition to that, bringing forward the CEM comparisons. So you're looking at fee benchmarking. Again, that's a really big area of scrutiny when you're looking at a board such as yours, making sure that you are paying competitive fees for all the services that are out there. And you are going through that process every other year at the moment, which is a really nice defined timeline to make sure that if you ever got a question from some kind of constituent, you could say, this is our process, here's the documentation that we have saved, and you have a really nice backup for why you are looking at those at the cadence that you are.
And by the way, I can't recall a client in our 200 plus clients that actually does a CEM review as often as you do. It's just a fact. So I thought I'd mention that.
Yeah.
We could save some money.
So we used to do it annually and we cut it back. Part of the Great Recession of 2018, when I got here and the budget was 15% upside down, we switched to every other year so that we'd have it heading into the legislative session. We'd have that information. We didn't really need it every year, but we definitely wanted it at least on a biennial basis.
And I would just hit on the last point here and, extend the offer again to echo what Jim was saying earlier. Obviously, we are working to bring forward education such as this today. Your asset class officers are doing the same. If there's ever a topic that as a board you feel like you could use further education on, that's something that we're happy to do on an ad hoc basis or to tailor these trainings as we move forward and continue to do them.
Any questions about this? Otherwise, there's a couple more pages on best practices that dig down a little bit deeper. I think they're worth doing because I think there are some parts of this that we dealt with so deeply yesterday, we can move on by. But these 2 pages, I think, are worth mentioning.
Sure. So looking at page.
Just so the best practices and then the additional details. So is this reflective of the best practices that we have adopted, or is this reflective of the best practices that a board managing, public funds should have, and then we check all the boxes?
It's absolutely
So there's nothing
both.
missing from the list that we're not doing.
If you look, as Paige said, about sort of what's the purpose of it, that's the best practice that's generic across funds. But she also talked about what you do in this area, and so it's both. And what's interesting is, for example, the work that the presentations you get from staff have evolved over time. They've become, in some ways, more transparent, sometimes less granular, but more informative, out of respect for your time, but not less informative. But I think that it's fair to say that if we went back to your predecessor and looked at those presentations versus what the board saw yesterday, they're not the same, and that evolution is a good thing. And it's based a lot on feedback from the board and from the executive director occasionally.
We had, from a staff perspective, we try to learn as we go. I mean, we know we're not going to be perfect, but there was, you can pinpoint in those individual reports we give you every quarter what that learning experience was. Something like, hey, we need to get down to macro attribution. We found that there was excess cash laying around. So we now have a greater level of granularity that we report to you on. We didn't used to have midpoints. That's new since I've gotten here. There was a broad range. The CIO could operate within that range, but there was no information for you on, well, are we underweight or overweight that midpoint? And we were very careful not to set it as a target, because we never wanted to be in the place of, oh, John, you're 50 basis points above the target in domestic equity, go sell, when maybe he wants to let that run because we're showing weakness elsewhere. So you can go down the reports and look back to 2017, 2016 and how they've changed. And it's been specific instances where we've gone through a CQI process to improve them.
And that midpoint's a great example of 2 things. One is that it is something that the RVK team has recommended as a best practice. And there was some reluctance to adopt it for various reasons, and some of them good. But eventually, the staff and RVK came to an agreement that this would be a good thing to do. And we happen to agree that it's not a target, but it does allow Aaron, for example, to tell you what the consequences of being away from the midpoint are. They can be positive, they can be negative, and it's something the board should know. So it's less a target than it is a lever for understanding the consequences of where the actual asset allocation is at any given point in time. What else we got, Paige?
So looking at page 19, this was an example of a project that RVK was actually engaged in outside of the scope of our standard services with the BOI. And I believe this came from a request from the legislature, if I'm remembering correctly.
It was so every year the Legislative Audit Division comes up with performance audits that they would like to perform. Our private equity investment strategy and underwriting and reporting was part of that. So rather than wait for them to come in, and I don't mean any offense by this, but they're not trained to do this sort of work. But if they were asking the question, we had every reason to believe that other legislators or participants or constituents would want to know. So we just got ahead of it and expanded RVK's role to perform this.
Going back to my comment about this board being, in our view, well above average in terms, and when I say this board, I'm talking about the staff as well, above average in best practice. We were even surprised when we dug in on this project because we told the staff, if we were gonna do this as an independent entity, we wanna pick the funds. Don't tell us what funds to look at. So we picked them, the ones that we looked at. And we interviewed everybody that was involved in the due diligence of the funds we selected to look at the chain of due diligence. And I gotta say, I speak for the whole team. We were impressed. We were very impressed. And so I'm hoping that the legislative body was impressed as well. They should have been, but you know, that's not our bailiwick.
Yeah, I guess my comment on slide 19 would be there are a lot of words and bullets included here, but I will cliff note it for you just to say, essentially the project was to re-underwrite the due diligence process that your staff is going through at the moment, in terms of sourcing and selecting investment managers. Predominantly the focus was on the private side of things, but we also did take a look at the current public manager search process. And as part of that project, we interviewed almost every member of the investment staff here, as well as a number of your peers that, you know, Jim, Becky, and I personally consult on and work with, and other broader firm relationships. And we would never pick favorites or rank the processes, but I would say the BOI's process did bubble to the top in terms of just the extreme amount of diligence and documentation that is going on for each of these processes. So we were very impressed. We did not find much to, you know, throw stones at when we were going through. And really just was a testament to the fact that you do have really good governance in place at the moment. And that will set you up well, again, just having that well-documented process that you're able to look back at if ever at any point in time there was a question about why you made a decision that you did.
So I think that's 19 and 20, is that?
That should wrap it up. Unless there's any questions, I'm happy to take any further questions on that project.
Any other questions? Maybe we'll do a short break and then circle back to the second half.
Excellent idea.
Is there a time on the coming back, please?
I think they abandoned Savannah. I don't think they gave us a time. I'm guessing just 5 or 10 minutes. I can kind of let you know when they're back if you want me to.
Great, no, that's fine. And then the break, is there a lunch? There's a lunch break at what time?
It looks like on the agenda, it's scheduled for noon.
Thank you, Savannah.
Yeah, of
Thank you.
course. Let me know if you need anything else.
Appreciate it. Bye.
New job.
All right, Savvy. Thank you. Right, back from the break, so we can continue on.
We're gonna skip 22 and 24, and I'll tell you why. This is just a review of our last year's capital market assumptions. I think that since we have a meeting coming up and we have fresh ones, it's better to spend time on that. The only thing I'll say about page 24 is that Dan mentioned earlier that you know, in the conversation about feeling compelled to produce ever higher returns because there's some expectation from some other entity or body or whatever, leads you to high concentrations of lots of dollars and high risk. This is called the capital markets line, and it basically says, it tries to visualize the relationship between risk and potential reward. But potential reward, as John and Dan pointed out, comes with high volatility. It's kind of like you can make the big bet, bet the ranch, so to speak. You can lose it, or you know, maybe you win somebody else's ranch. But where we have seen institutional investors reach for risk, they move out this curve to more private equity, lots of emerging markets, commodities, lots of international stocks, and so on, in hopes of generating much higher returns. And what we have found is that occasionally there's some winners, but there are also some big losers. And so when we talk about where a client should be on what's called the capital markets line, we think about how much illiquidity can they tolerate given their benefit payments, given all of the things that are idiosyncratic to their situation. And that's why there are no sort of formulas that say, oh, you know, if you're this much funded, you should take this much risk. Ain't necessarily so. And in fact, the amount of risk that you take is also reflective of your judgment as fiduciaries about the balance between pursuing future returns and protecting the assets that are in your trust. That's a balance that, you know, that is uniquely and only subjectively. There is no formula to tell you what to do. This is in your sense of how I execute my duty between future returns and the protection of the assets that I am sitting on right now that are in my trust, but for some other purpose. They're not mine.
So a question on this line, the further out you go, the more risk, but you're also hitting your liquidity, you're less liquid, right?
You are absolutely right. In fact, I made that note and I forgot to say it, that things like private equity, things like emerging market equity, even things like MLPs, even though they trade in the public markets, they trade very thinly. And so you have a tendency to see less liquidity at the far end of the capital markets line, but primarily you're seeing more volatility risk.
So that goes in your process of what's your asset allocation going to be, right?
Absolutely.
As far as how liquid you need to be.
Sure.
If you don't mind, we're also going to skip 27, 28, 29, because when this training was created, we used data, we had data up through the middle of 2025, but we just spent yesterday with much fresher data doing the same thing. So let's not focus in on that. Let's instead move to page 30. And
Jim, on the capital market line.
yeah,
I mean, you said there's no kind of answer to exactly how you should be allocated or for each fund, but it does, the approach in the graph does kind of lean itself towards like some sort of a optimization model that has a end result, at least that's maybe a starting point. I mean, is that part of the asset allocation discussion?
absolutely.
You guys go through?
I'm going to throw that one to Paige, and Paige, you might talk about the panel underneath the asset allocation output that shows essentially the sum of the weightings of the various asset classes in various allocations and how they do boil down to a number that is reflective of all of those and their weightings, but is targeting the total portfolio.
From the liquidity perspective?
From risk, all types of risk. We don't actually, do we have an asset allocation? We should.
Answer to your question, yes. So when John sends over, the way the asset allocation practice works, all of the cabinet plus John and me send John our thoughts on asset allocation for the subsequent year. There's then two scenarios. John's, then some other made up version that John comes up with because we don't get to do asset allocation. But we send a couple of scenarios over to RVK. They then run the MVO analysis, and underneath that MVO analysis, it shows expected returns for various portfolios and then provides the problem with MVOs is it'll always push you to, oh, well, just go straight into equities and no fixed income, no cash. So we put the constraints around that to try to come up with what a realistic portfolio would look like. So we'll pull it from last October and send it around. But yes, there is some steering, the model does steer you toward some optimized portfolios. And then I think in the regular reports we get, what's the efficient frontier that shows on the quarterly reports as well.
I just drew, sorry, I can make my own output here. So essentially what the modeling is doing, right? You're saying we're putting in real world constraints and saying we're gonna let you pick up this much US equity, this much fixed income. It's then going to optimize the
Or
trade-off.
something in between.
Yeah, something in between. And it's going to run like a simulation based off of all the inputs we put in, and it will spit out model portfolios. So essentially on this end, if this is your efficient frontier, over here, you're gonna have your less risky, also less return portfolios. And it's also gonna give you a spectrum on the other end. If you move out on the frontier, if you're willing to take on a little more risk, you're gonna have a trade-off of also a little more return. We're also modeling, so maybe your portfolio, right, is gonna end up here. And the general theory is you wanna be on to the efficient frontier or as close to it as possible because you're maximizing every unit of risk that you're taking on with every unit of return that you're able to generate also. So there's really no wrong place to be on the efficient frontier, if you will. It kind of goes back to that though. We have a return target that we're trying to hit, right? So we have, or we think is reasonable to hit. So maybe
Or a
we.
risk target, it could be a risk target.
Or a risk target. So we generally have this like, we can hone in maybe on an area of the efficient frontier that we think is reasonable to look at. And then that's the discussion we're having with your team and with the board also ultimately is, does everyone feel comfortable with where we're sitting on the efficient frontier? Is there a desire from the board to maybe take some risk off the table, recognizing that we're gonna lower the return target, but we feel like that's the prudent thing to do, or vice versa. So the outputs that are coming out of the model are the expected return, the expected risk, which is approximated by standard deviation or volatility. And then you have all kinds of metrics from there, like what's the liquidity profile of the portfolio look like? One of the metrics we look at, Jim will talk about this in the risk section, but there's a lot more risk associated with downside risk than upside risk. So we always model out, we get a 2008, 2009 scenario again. What is the worst possible case for your portfolio? And can we stomach that number? Because it's very easy to say, right, like I have a high risk tolerance. I feel okay about that. And then seeing a return come through of, a negative 30% hit that you could take in any given day is a pretty different scenario.
I want you to look at the shape of that curve because it's important. All efficient frontiers look like that. It's not because of the way we model it. It's based in financial theory. And basically what it says is that more risk is better, but it's incrementally less better and less better and less better. You notice how it flattens out? Well, on the horizontal axis, you're taking more and more risk, but the incremental benefit you're getting is shrinking, 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 shrinking. So we'll talk more about that during asset allocation time, but there's a diminishing marginal return to returns from taking more risk. And as Paige said, we'll give you analyses that show that if you push that way out, then in any given year, what happens is the potential downside that you could experience gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a whole bunch of complications associated with that you can imagine. So going back to your original question, yes, that capital markets line with the different levels of risk as you go out, different combinations of those will be in these sample portfolios, including the ones that John and Dan give us, including a few that we insert too, as well as the ones that the model spits out to create this efficient frontier. So I hope that's responsive.
Very, very much so. I liked the drawing especially.
I
Thank
would I would add just one thing, which is we have often gotten caught up at times when we've shown this to the board in kind of what I will call a false precision around this, because this model is very sensitive to what our assumptions are in terms of returns for each of the asset classes and the correlations and all that. I mean, it's a great tool. It's a great place to start. But what it really, in my mind, ultimately tells you is, well, you know, you're kind of looking at the relative returns, right? You know, you think private equity is going to do better than, you know, fixed income. And so it will push you towards that. And that is all interesting. And it gives you kind of, you know, those outputs. We often, you know, we may disagree about, well, what should those inputs be? You know, and so we sometimes model a few different scenarios around that. So it's a process. It's a good tool to use. It doesn't give you the answer. And that's, people get stuck on that a lot and say, oh, well, you know, you're going to be on the efficient frontier, but it's only, you know, you're only going to get 6.8% and your hurdle is 7.3. And I'm like, well, you know.
Yeah, I agree. But it tells you where the best portfolio, which you can't figure out in advance. It tells you at least the region where it is likely to lie.
Right.
And so it actually informs your conversation, because you can dispense with the parts of the combinations, the asset allocations that simply have very low likelihood of either meeting your risk expectations, your return expectations, your liquidity expectations, and allows you to look at a region that says, pretty likely that the best asset allocation we can figure out lies somewhere in here. And John is correct. That space will show that there are sometimes quite small differences between them, and it will make it hard to choose. That's a good thing. It means that the region has been well defined, where it most likely, the best shot most likely. And even though this is a strategic one, that if the current conditions lasted forever, it would be your best shot. You have to, this is why you do asset allocation redo it on a regular basis, because expectations for forward returns may be low now, but after COVID and after the GFC, we raised our expectations through the roof. And so some people who say, oh, you know, they're protecting the assets too much, they're not pursuing enough return, that's not a permanent situation necessarily. We get a big downturn in the market, as we did in 2022. We could turn on a dime and say, no, this is a time to actually make sure that you have ample risk assets, because they just got made a lot cheaper. So anyway, I did want to talk a little bit about page 30, because they're my favorite page. You may recall yesterday, one of my themes, maybe the most important one, was this investment strategy that your staff and you have put together has a slightly below, slightly more conservative bent to it all through the portfolio, in terms of both asset allocation and asset class structures. And you can see that in the upper right-hand panel. I mentioned yesterday that you only capture 89% of the upside that is available in markets over the last 10 years, but you only capture 63% of the downside. So that means that every time there's a down market, you are left at the end of it when markets turn with more assets than the average folks out there. And you would think, well, that doesn't sound so great, but over time, it actually adds to compound return, and it can add quite a lot. And so it is a rare circumstance that an investment strategy could have more than 100% upside capture and way less than 100% downside capture. That we just don't see that. It's very, very difficult, certainly to have a strategy that does that over time. The other thing that goes along with this theme is on the left-hand side. Notice that there are two dots. One of them is the blue dot, and that is we're talking about risk return space. This is one area where peer returns do have some informative value, and those peer returns, both a risk and return number captured in this matrix, are in the gray boxes. Notice that your benchmark is much more volatile than your actual execution, which is your green dot, number one. And this is over 10 years. And also notice that you are able to get higher returns. That's the green dot lies higher than the blue dot, which is your benchmark. This is a very good 10-year outcome, because it means that you are in the what we call the northwest quadrant, taking less risk than the median fund and way less risk than your benchmark is experiencing, but at the same time actually eking out some higher returns. There's no one thing that you're doing that can accomplish this very beneficial goal. It's things like careful rebalancing that John and his staff do. It's careful selection of, it's careful asset class structuring to try to get that, minimize the downside, but still capture as much of the upside as possible. And that's why I complimented Aaron and John and Dan yesterday for the leading place that you find yourself in terms of attribution of returns in the portfolio. We have a tool that does exactly the same thing, but you guys have a very strong DIY, do-it-yourself ethic here, ethos, and you've done a very good job at that.
So just another question there. So obviously, like, this is impacted by our private equity exposure on the top left.
Yes. Private equity's volatility, as it's expressed in your benchmark, is higher because it's also capturing some of that illiquidity risk, but in the form of volatility. Whereas your actual experience volatility is less because of that lagging effect that we talked about in detail yesterday.
Yeah, I guess kind of two questions. One, do we feel like our private equity allocation, and this is probably for John, is in the additional return that we expect to receive from that allocation is worth kind of the impact it has on our kind of reporting and the kind of the transparency evaluations over time? I guess that's one question. And then in thinking about, private equity in particular, do you really, at the end of the day, do you really feel that there's less volatility than, a small cap, benchmark? Or is it just the dynamic of the illiquidity and the lagging valuations that then kind of recalculates into an assumed lower volatility, even though in reality you have somewhat equal volatility?
I think it's somewhat equal volatility. I mean, if those things were priced every day, they'd be more volatile. So yeah, it's kind of a fake volatility measure to a degree.
Yeah.
I understand that. The more important question to me, I guess, is to your point, do you feel like the juice is worth the squeeze there? I guess, why are we in private equity? Does it provide a benefit? And I think there's a few answers there. I mean, and the primary one I always lean towards is, you know, we've seen, especially in the markets that we play in, okay? So Thomas has noted many times, you know, we kind of prefer the lower middle market portion of the private equity space, generally speaking, okay? And so those truly would be small cap type companies, right? And we can't access those companies any other way at this point. You know, the IPO market, nobody really wants to go public anymore. And if they do want to go public, so the space for which they used to go public, you know, maybe if you were $100 million company 20 years ago, you would try to go public. That the goalposts have moved because of, you know, a lot of different reasons, but you almost have to be a multi-billion-dollar company that's private before you're going to want to try and go IPO. Okay. So there's this huge portion of the market that you just can't access outside of sort of being in those types of funds and those types of firms. And we see good opportunities there, I think. And we see a different mix, I think, sometimes of opportunities within the various sectors and companies that you might be able to own that you just kind of can't replicate in the public markets anymore. Now, people certainly make the argument, you know, well, why don't you just, I mean, the popular argument more recently has been, well, why don't you just own the S&P 500 because it's done so darn well. And fair enough. Okay, you have. If you're okay with being even more concentrated to, you know, the Mag 7, and you would have done fabulously over the last, you know, 10, 15 years or so. I get it, but I don't think that's, you know, really a very good argument for the long term and for the diversification aspects that are out there. And we do think we can, you know, find these opportunities within the smaller space where they're going to still get us pretty good returns, and we can make, you know, and we have thus far at least made a decent hurdle over public markets. We're a perpetual institution. We're cautious about our liquidity in that respect. I mean, I think I've said to you fairly recently here that, you know, I think we're kind of there. The discussion we had in October, we've increased our private investments pretty steadily over the last probably decade or so, you know, incremental increases, but, you know, call it maybe 1% a year. I think we're kind of there, partly because of that liquidity issue, you know, so our illiquid portion of the portfolio, if I look at everything, is, you know, call it roughly a third of the portfolio. I think I'm comfortable with that. We can handle that. And I don't feel like we're going to get put in a position where, hey, I've got to pay benefits and I don't have, you know, the appropriate liquidity to make that without selling something that I don't want to have to sell. So
Hey.
long-winded answer, but I think
No, that's great.
John.
That's very helpful.
Hey, John and Jim, if we go back to the kind of along the same question, if we go back to the efficient frontier / the capital market line, what are we using as the proxy there for private equity that gives us the stand? I mean, we're certainly not using the MSCI small cap there, are we? Or because then that would say we should just be investing in MSCI small cap. So what are we using that shows us that private equity is at X return and 23% standard deviation or whatever it looks like?
Well, I think that page there's actually an explanation of our.
So if we look at page 24, and we see
that.
private equity sitting at, say, let's call it 10% and 23% return. You guys used to create that, you used a proxy, and that proxy is Burgess, or you used Cambridge or something, but certainly you didn't use the MSCI small cap for that.
The answer is it's Cambridge and the assumption.
Okay.
And you can see that, John, on page 23, left-hand side, 5 lines up from the bottom.
Okay.
But I also wanted to address Jeff's question, which is an excellent one, and it's one that is at the heart of, should we do private equity at all? Since inception, and we're talking about now 2003, so we're talking about a pretty long period of time, private equity has produced on an annual basis about 1.7% more than public equity. Now, that doesn't mean every year, and in fact, in recent years, the public markets have been superb and they've actually produced more than private equity. But as John pointed out, you guys are in this for the long game. So if the long game, it has shown 1.7%, then the question becomes, is that enough to compensate us for taking illiquidity risk? And the answer to that question can only be done by looking at how much illiquidity risk you are actually taking, which is to John's point. And that's why we in the asset allocation, we in your quarterly reporting, we in your asset liability analyses always look at the degree of illiquidity you're taking on. Because if you had 50 or 60% of your portfolio in illiquids, 1.7%, given the other things that you have a negative cash flow in terms of contributions and benefit payments, would not be enough. But you are not nowhere near that number in terms of illiquidity. And we have said, and I think longer time board members have heard us say often, that there is a ceiling on how much illiquidity you should have in the portfolio, because there are consequences to overreaching that. And if you do push it beyond that, you better get more than 1.7%, even though 1.7% per year it's actually pretty good. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
The last one I wanted to deal with is page 33. This is a little bit in the vein of risk management. And I want to draw your attention to that green dotted line, because it's really the only one that counts. And these are all your major asset classes and their sensitivity to the US stock market. We know that equities have generally a higher return than most other asset classes, in fact, pretty much all of them. But we also know that they are very volatile. And so there's a trade-off there. And so one of the things we are always asking ourselves with respect to how much volatility is in the total portfolio is answered in that green dotted line, which is the sum of the volatilities from your other asset classes. And the good news there is that, back in the early teens, you were running at about 0.6 in terms of your beta. This is called total fund beta. But think of it as how sensitive is our total fund return to what's happening in the US equity market. But as you've diversified, you have dropped down below that and you've kept it very steady. And we think this is something we look at every quarter, not that it jumps around every quarter. In fact, it better not. But because a trend upward by, say, 5 percentage points would mean that suddenly there's a lot more sensitivity to what's happening in a single higher volatility part of your portfolio than you have become accustomed to. So I just wanted to point that out, that's a number that we look at quite often. Any other questions about that? I thought we'd end up by spending some time on risk. And do you want me to handle that, or do you want to take a shot at it?
You want to take the first slide and I can take it from there?
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, because there's a lot of slides. That's a good deal.
Hey, before we move to risk, so if we go to page 36 with private asset benchmarking, thanks for doing that. That was helpful. I wanted to see if it may, kind of get your view on. It might be interesting, and I think if we actually would look very, it might even look better for. It would be interesting for the board, and I think would be probably reflective of the good work done by the staff. Do you ever suggest looking at like total value, TVPI and like paid in cash, like what is the actual multiple times return of what we invested? Because that's kind of a nice, I think that would really, I'm guessing, show very well, that it's done a lot for us. And so I was curious as to, do you see other entities using that as kind of a helpful item? And just to pick your brain on that a little bit.
Yeah, John, this is a replay of the conversation that you and I had yesterday. So we'll replay it again. And that is that there are a panoply of other metrics that ask different questions or have a different sort of angle of view on the performance of a private equity portfolio. And that's true of all private investments, actually. And DPI is one of them. But there are no clients that use that as a primary or secondary benchmark because it answers a very narrow but can be important question. But in the deep dive that staff did in October, John, on private equity, there were a lot of those other metrics. So I would encourage you, and I'm sure John could provide that deep dive back to you. You can see that that's that there are other metrics that are utilized. The staff typically presents those because they are much more granular in nature, and because our charge is to inform the board about the total portfolio and its major asset class performance versus benchmarks. Those other metrics are secondary to our charge to help the board. So I'll stop there. I hope that was responsive.
It's helpful. Thank you. Is it hard to, I'm always having trouble wrapping my brain around this, Jim. So I appreciate your advice here. So when the whole comparison of time weighted for private equity, like the time weighted, do you hate like time weighted return view versus cash return view, or what do you think is really the valuable way to look? It would be awesome to hear your view on that.
Yeah, I don't hate anything. The question is, I need to do two things when I think about it, and that's how RVK thinks about it. One is, what question about the asset class does it answer, or does it help answer? How dependable is it? And two is, how informative is it over various time periods? So time-weighted rate of returns for private equity are not very informative over 1 quarter, half a year, even sometimes 3 years. They are very informative over 7, 10, and longer periods. In fact, the since inception number that I just talked about in response to the chair's question about that 1.7% premium, those are time-weighted rate of returns. And they're very informative because they stretch back to 2003. The longer the time frame, the more informative and the more dependable they are. I hope that's responsive, John.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. It's a hard subject, and so it's like it's very interesting to get education on it.
Yeah, I often, when I'm asked to testify before legislatures, I often will open with the comment that anybody who thinks that it's easy to invest billions of dollars has not done it. That's a given. I have never found anybody that actually was responsible for investing billions and said, this is easy. But I guess there's somebody out there. I just haven't run into them. So we look at investment risks, and there are so many different kinds of risks. We often talk about volatility risk because it plays into many of these. We talk about liquidity risk because it plays into these. But you know, and so risks are interactive with one another, but they go well beyond just volatility and liquidity. So plan structure and the ability to make benefits, pay benefits and pay them on time, that goes back to a connection to liquidity risk. And liquidity risk is interconnected to how volatile the portfolio is. But there are also things that are risks that you don't necessarily control. At least in your structure here in Montana with a board of investment. And that is the stability of contributions and the level of contributions. In many states, the contribution policy is executed by a pension board, and the pension board also executes the investment strategy. We have a number of clients like that. In fact, I think you attended one yesterday in California. And so those are risks to the plan, to the defined benefit plan. And in some cases, the fiduciaries have some control over them, and in other cases, not so much. In your case, not quite as much, although I know from Dan's work with the legislature that you do weigh in on these topics quite frequently because they matter. Investment plan assets, we talk about volatility. There's a special kind of risk that's called permanent loss of capital. You know, volatility means that something goes up or something goes down, but we expect it at some point over time, at some pace, to return to what we would call normality. But a permanent loss of capital is exactly what it says. The capital's gone. And so those risk analysts will often look at permanent loss of capital and the risk of same as almost in an, I wouldn't say another category, but clearly different than just volatility. You know, we just went through 2022, and I'm old enough to have been in the business in the inflation of the late 70s and early 80s before Volcker and the administration killed it. And thank God they did. But it was painful to kill that inflation. And what we saw in 2022 was a brief but very powerful example and painful example that inflation may be the single biggest risk to investments generally, but particularly to defined benefit plans. They set off a chain of negative reactions, whether it's the shrinkage of PEs for high PE stocks. It's debt. Inflation is death for bonds. And the only thing that tends to benefit eventually from inflation is cash. And sometimes over the longer run, equity as well in terms of dividends, but that takes a lot longer. But we also have risks in terms of the structure of asset classes. We've talked about that. We also have risks about manager performance. We've done, off the cuff studies of how important is asset allocation in terms of manager performance. And what we find is that asset allocation, if you're 5 percentage points away from where you would really like to be for an important asset class, it can swamp all of your manager performance, whether it's negative or positive. It's just so much bigger. And so we encourage people not to fail to manage, to monitor and carefully select and terminate managers, which you have done in spades over time, but to also keep in mind that you're playing with the top few percent of the performance, which can make a difference, but the bulk of it is in asset class or in asset allocation, asset class structure, and just the good execution of your investment strategy. We talk about operational risk. That's why you have a custody bank. That's why every quality institutional investor has a custody bank for safekeeping of assets. It's also why I complimented your accounting staff yesterday. You have an unusually complicated situation in which you have so many clients. Dan, what are you up to now? Is it 40 some different clients that you manage money for? It's a long list.
Well, for STIP,
For
for
STIP,
several hundred.
500 plus in STIP and
Yeah,
70 or so
60,
separate
70
accounts.
for
Yeah,
separate
they do.
accounts.
So even putting aside STIP, I mean, you have a major accounting challenge that has only grown in the years that we've worked with you. I mean, it wasn't I think in the high 30s years ago, and it just every time the legislature sees a reason to fund something, you get the call, which is you should be complimented.
It's the legislature, it's the next Superfund site or who knows what. I'm always amazed that there's some other thing that pops up and needs a new separate account.
So we talk about funds transfer here. Obviously, you have processes for controlling that. The one that you don't in the operational category is benefit determination and payments. That belongs to the pension plans. You're off the hook for that risk, but it is a risk. I managed a $50 billion state pension plan where I inherited a situation in which a judge had just decided that for thousands of beneficiaries, thousands of participants, the system had miscalculated their accrued benefit. It was a nightmare. I had to go out and lease a whole several set of floors. I had to staff it with people that would go back and fix every one of those accounts. It was not my favorite thing. I don't even want to think about it anymore. And then there's the reputational aspect. I just said that you should take it as a compliment that the state of Montana feels that this is a good home for assets that need managed until they are needed for their purposes. There are benefits that that come from having a strong positive reputation. We feel that for our own firm as well, as you could tell from the pride I took in the SEC audit results for our firm. There's this issue of what is often referred to as headline risk is not insignificant, and it can cause a lot of problems. So I'll stop there. I don't know how much more time do you want to run here? Because we've done quite a lot, Mr. Chair, and
4.5 hours to cover the next 10 slides.
well then,
Buckle up now.
then with the blessing of the chair, have at it for the next 4.5 hours.
No, please continue, and then maybe as we kind of approach noon, we can open up for any other questions if somebody might.
Absolutely. Yeah, I bet we can wrap up even earlier than that. I'm gonna move to page 38, the next slide in the deck here. This is more just framing out a lot of those concepts that Jim just covered. I'd say this is one of our most heavily used slides at RVK because it's the process by which we approach portfolio construction for all of our clients. So the investment decision-making hierarchy is what we call this. And the general concept, like Jim just laid out, is that as a board, the bulk of your time should be spent on everything that falls on the left-hand side of the page. So when you're going through the process, not every year necessarily with asset liability, that's more of every 3 to 5 years, but your decision that you have is you have plan assets versus plan liabilities. An asset liability study, which is handled at the pension board level, is the only study that connects your contribution policy, your benefits policy, and your asset allocation policy. So that's really the governing framework by which you're then funneling down all of the decisions that come after that. So once you go through that high level asset liability study, that is when your asset allocation study is coming into play. Again, when you're looking at the investment results, asset allocation is going to be the largest driver of the outcome that you have from those results. So that is why we go through the process of asset allocation every single year. Again, that doesn't mean every single year we're going to come to you or John's going to come to you and recommend changes to that asset allocation. But we are continually reviewing based on changes in capital markets. And again, you should be surprised if you ever saw a huge change come in any given year to the asset allocation, right? So where it's kind of that analogy of we have the large ship that we're making very incremental changes to on any given year. If we're doing our jobs well and forecasting the risks and the returns for each of these asset classes, it would be strange to come, and say, we're going to recommend you move 50% of the portfolio into any given asset class because we are continually taking in information and bringing that to you.
Well, but if that were the case, there's something that's gonna have occurred big time that's gonna already inform us.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Something catastrophic is gonna occur somewhere.
We never want to be surprised. We never want to be surprised. We never want you to be surprised, right? That's why we have this dialogue going on all the time. So the asset allocation study, again, that's where you're making that decision of how much risk do we want to be taking on? What's the level of return that we're targeting? You are pulling in other comparisons, like how much illiquidity do we feel like we can take on? And that's where we're also doing that work of comparing to peers just to get a benchmark of what other asset class trends are coming through that we might want to consider for your own asset allocation. So then from there, that's when we move on to the right-hand side of the page where I would draw the line and say, kind of like Jim, I would echo him and say, these are the decisions that are going to be more on the margin, right? How should we structure each of the asset classes? What is the active versus passive implementation within each of these asset classes going to be? And then you'll notice on the very far right-hand side of the page here, that's the first time you see the word manager. So that's intentional, and I hope you see that mirrored, when we're giving presentations to the board and having these discussions. You should rarely, if ever, hear a specific manager name come out of any of our mouths. It's not because we don't think they're important, and if any of them are listening, we value their work very much for you. But that's where the due diligence process really comes in, right? By the time it comes to selecting any individual asset manager that's going to come into the portfolio, we've done a lot of that risk mitigation up front to ensure that anyone who comes in, maybe you're deciding between 3 different managers for an allocation. At that point in time, you can be guaranteed that any manager who's been discussed and made it to that point is institutional quality, and you're really splitting hairs at that point before they make it into the portfolio. And then it's really just monitoring those managers from there. Again, there are many reasons that a manager could be terminated, performance being one of them. I would say it's not always performance that comes through for a manager termination decision, though. More often than not, it's something like we saw like an organizational change. If your lead portfolio manager on a strategy would depart, that would be a red flag that we're going to trigger immediate review because it's a key man risk for that portfolio. There are other things that could come through. Something we keep an extra eye on is manager assets under management. There is a desire, right, for these managers to gather more assets and make more money, and that can be counterproductive at times to the ability to manage that strategy effectively. So that's something that we're monitoring on an ongoing basis, and your staff is also monitoring. And if any of those alarm bells were ever to go off, that would cause a review, and you might see a change come through. But bottom line, I hope I kind of go back to like that governance framework that we talk about and that we laid out. You're going to see like those same asset allocation studies come to you every year. You're going to see the asset class reviews come through from your staff, and they're going to update you if there's any changes made to the structure. And that's really where most of your time as a board should and has been spent historically.
And by that time, 80% or more of your return and the risk that you're taking has been baked in. And the only thing I would say that might be a slight variation on what Paige said is it's not so much that you target a return at the asset allocation level, you target a pair of numbers, return and risk. So they always come joined at the hip. So it's really the pair that you look at and you say, am I most comfortable with this pair of expected return and expected risk? Because they're all forecasts and they're all not going to be right. But they're the best that can be forecast given what we know about the world. So it's always the pair that you are looking at and saying, which one am I most comfortable with?
I feel like the next 3 slides say a lot of the same things that we've just hit on. So I'm going to move ahead to slide 42. And again, borrow a quote from one of the earlier slides. When we're looking at risk management, the goal is not to eliminate all risks that exist. It's to understand them and to monitor them and to mitigate them as they arise. So that's kind of what this cycle here says, right? The first step is to know the risks that exist to you. So inherently as an investor, right, you're going to be taking on equity market risk. You're going to be taking on interest rate risk. You're going to be taking on inflation risk. The list goes on and on and on. So identifying those risks and then understanding why am I taking on those risks for all of those risks I just named because you have to, right? If you're going to be investing to any kind of degree that does require taking on risk. So then how do I quantify it? So I would say an enhancement that we've actually brought forward in the last few years to help you quantify this is we did add a dedicated section to your performance report, the risk report. It's not that we were not monitoring and reporting on that before. A lot of those risk metrics are baked into the broader performance report, but it is nice to have a dedicated section we can turn to now that has about 10 dedicated pages in it. And that's what we're trying to do in that risk report is quantify those risks that you're taking on. So we do break down the portfolio into, the level of sensitivity that you have to the different parts of the market. How much of your portfolio are we monitoring for equity risk, for interest rate risk, so on and so forth. Calculating a lot of the risk statistics that Jim touched on both yesterday and today. We're monitoring, the volatility. We're monitoring the beta at the total fund level and both at the asset class levels. And we're monitoring those over time, which I would say is the more important factor here, right? If you're looking at a data point at any point in time, it's difficult to get a grasp on whether it's reasonable, if it sticks off the page or not. That is the true benefit of reviewing this performance on an ongoing quarterly basis, is we're able to pinpoint for you if there's any point in time which we see a major shift in any of these metrics that we're monitoring. And again, that would trigger us to take a look and then report back anything to you that we think is noteworthy, or if we think any shifts are needed in your current strategy.
Sometimes we run into situations where a trustee on a board, and it has only ever happened once, I think, in the history of working with this board, where they're only focused on one sort of metric or one risk. But the challenge with that is that it simply doesn't work. You have more of getting rid of one risk entirely means that you're almost surely amping up the other risks in the portfolio. Give you an example. If you were to say, I want to get rid of all illiquidity risk in the portfolio, all of it. So you move everything into nothing but daily publicly traded entities. Fine, you haven't actually achieved your objective because there are some publicly traded sub-asset classes that have liquidity challenges. But the more important thing is you've probably amped up your risk of failing to meet your actuarial benchmark. And because the public markets may or may not deliver what you need. And you certainly have amped up your short-term volatility because we know that there is this dampening effect of private investments. So, it is impossible to be a good institutional investor and essentially be a one-trick pony. You have to look at the whole thing, even though, as you pointed out during the break, this stuff is complicated. I mean, it's all connected. Less of one thing sometimes means more of another. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Just a few final slides. These are the fun ones, I promise. Fun for finance. Other concepts on page 43. These are just other terms you might hear, in the headlines when you're looking around. You're attending conferences, right? Leverage is obviously something that can be applied in many different ways. A lot of your private managers are taking on leverage in the implementation of their strategies. There are funds out there who apply leverage at the total fund level. That is risky. And for some investors, they've made the decision that that's worth it. But when you're taking on leverage, you're essentially doubling down on your bet in either direction, right? So that is just something you want to keep an eye on. That's something within your private programs. Leverage is something that is monitored very closely, both when a commitment is being recommended and on an ongoing basis. And since you're not talking about putting leverage on at the total fund level, I won't drone on about it because I
So
don't
you're
think.
staying away from leverage, right?
Yeah, at least at the total fund level.
Well, this came up yesterday in the discussion about the conservative bent in the private credit program. We talked about, I mentioned that there were several things you should be concerned about. And one of them is the risk posture that has been taken by the managers that you hire. And John said, They don't take any risk at all. No, no, they do take leverage, but it's lower than the industry norm. And that again is a reflection of
So
your
that's part of your
somewhat more
intelligence.
conservative bend.
Yeah, we're always very cognizant of how, I mean, ultimately it's understanding how do your managers make money, right? So if you think about the classic, private equity leverage buyout strategy, it's, you can lever up to the hilt. You can really amp up your returns, and the reverse of that situation, when it doesn't go so well, you can really ramp up your losses. And so we're always cognizant of how they're
You can
doing
even
that.
have a permanent loss of capital.
You
which
can
is the
have,
worst
definitely
kind.
have a permanent loss of capital.
Okay.
And so we're very cognizant of those things. It's why we talk about, I mean, I don't know if it always comes through about, when we say we want to deal with managers who have an operational focus, so what we're really getting at is they have a way of making money by making this company better in some other way than just levering up, right? That's the financial manipulation that may get you to make more money, but it can be very dangerous. So we're super cognizant of those things, and it's certainly not that they don't use leverage in any of the strategies that we deal with. And it's a perfectly okay thing to do, but you need to be cognizant of, how much are we comfortable with? How much do we think that manager can take on and still, when Thomas says our private equity managers, as an example, have, a turn or two less leverage, what that really buys them is flexibility when things go wrong. It's the downside protection scenario, which is kind of what we're always thinking about, because the managers come in and tell you how rosy and how beautiful everything is going to be, and they're going to make a ton of money, and you're going to make a ton of money. You want to get past that. Okay, well, when things go bad, because they will at some point or another. How good is your ability to weather that storm and not take the permanent capital loss that Jim's talking about? So that's what we're always concerned about.
Market timing is always a fun topic to hit on. I think that was probably one of my most disappointing things to learn as a finance student who moved into the world of institutional finances. How little of that actually is happening, right? And just how hard it is to do. I think, you
How infrequently it shows any success.
yeah, no, my new favorite analogy is there's like a study out there, I think, and sorry, I think they surveyed a bunch of men, but it was, how many of you think you could like land a commercial airplane if you needed to? And it was something crazy, like 9 out of 10 men said that they could do it.
Let's take a survey.
So I hope that I'm never in that position of, that plane.
the only one that can actually do it is.
I can land one.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
she could do it.
But it's kind of a similar, the research is really similar with market timing, right? There is this like idea in our brains that it's much easier to execute on a short-term dislocation in the market if and when it arises. And unfortunately, most all of the evidence shows that it's very, very hard to time the markets. And you'll see that baked into everything that you're doing here at the BOI. You'll never hear anyone from RVK come in and say, like, we need to tactically make this move to try and, take advantage of this dislocation. We don't believe in tactical asset allocation. Your staff is not. Outside of, reasonable cash movements, making efforts to time the markets, to juice your returns. We are sticking to the long-term strategy that you have in place. And that really underpins every decision that's being made here when it comes to moving money around. I do, just since I'm on that tangent on 44, this really backs up the data here. So I'd say it's twofold here, right? It's one that we're not going to be tactically allocating assets. It's two that anytime money is being moved around, there are very, very large efforts being made to ensure that you are staying exposed to the markets, right? So if you were to be transitioning, say you did need to terminate a manager, your staff and your custodian and everyone else involved is working to ensure that you are maintaining exposure to the markets, because even just being out of the market for one day can have a huge impact on your portfolio. So I'd say those are all areas that are being baked into the risk behind the scenes, to make sure that you're not being penalized. by either overexposing yourself or trying to time the market with any of these movements.
There is no investment exposure that is without risk. Some people think, and you had a former CIO that maybe had this thought as well because he was a big champion of big cash positions, but that, oh, we can be safe if we're in cash. Well, you're safe from one thing, but you're highly exposed to the other. The thing you're safe from or safer from is a downtick in risk assets. The thing that you are not safe from that you're at great risk to is if risk assets go up, as this chart shows, you don't have to be out of the market for long before you miss a year's worth of return. And so for a perpetual fund, it's not a game, you really want to play. Unless John has a new formula or algorithm.
Not yet.
Not yet.
That's a really incredible chart.
Isn't
When
it?
you think
I
of
mean,
just the handful of days
yeah.
Yep.
and the potential impact.
Yeah, I mean, missing 5 days, right, to reduce
Yeah.
your annualized return by 2.6%. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it proves the point there. The last slide I'll cover here, on page 45. So we talked a little about return chasing, right? And we always caution, while it's helpful to compare ourselves to peers, you don't really want to be return chasing because the pattern that you'll see a lot of the time, so it says swing for the fences here, right? A good example of this would be if you took a peer fund of yours over the last 5 to 10 year time period who had a really high allocation to public equity. It makes sense that they're really high, I'm going to say 70%, right, in public equity.
Wow, that'd be really high.
Really high, underline. It wouldn't be surprising to you that they'd probably outperformed you over that time period and ranked higher, right? So I think we have to be careful to not anchor ourselves to that and say well, who's that fund in our peer group who just really knocked it out of the park over that time period? And you have to remind yourself that while they did really well in that time period, there are also going to be time periods within that 10 years where they got crushed, right? If you think back to April of last year when a lot of the tariff news was coming out and we saw a huge hit in the public equity markets, a fund that was that allocated to public equity is going to do very, very poorly in that time period. That's a short amount of time, right? If we were to go farther back all the way to be capturing a time period like 2008, 2009, obviously, you would be amazed by how big of an impact that small amount of time can have over that entire time period. And again, that is the philosophy behind how you're structured as a fund. We're going for consistency with returns. So what we have shown here on the bottom, I'm going to point to the bottom table because this is actually the returns for the PERS here for the BOI. And you can see if I look at these individual calendar years, there should be very few you can pick out where you're ranking. You don't see any number ones on here. There are a few numbers smaller than 10, but for the most part, we're looking at numbers between, 25 and 75. And that's kind of the sweet spot that we want to be in. We're in, maybe above median most of the time. So a number smaller than 50, but if you're able to have consistent returns, I'll pick out the last 5 here, ranking in the 40th percentile, the 30th, the 38th, the 29th, the 36th. None of those is even a top quartile return, actually. But if I go all the way over to the right-hand side of the page here, you can see over the trailing 20 years, you're ranking in the 12th percentile relative to your peers. So that is almost a top decile return. And it's really that consistency of returns that you've been able to achieve over that time period. The pattern that we would not want to see is, ranking in the 1st and then the 100th and back and forth, because really what that means is you're taking on a lot more downside risk than your peers. So when you have that loss of capital, you have a smaller base that you're building back on. And it's just bad for everyone to have excess volatility in the fund. It's harder for John to manage his liquidity needs. It's harder to pace everything out and to make sure that you're having the consistency of returns. Again, it's that concept I would go back to.
Yeah, and if you look at the top panel and, we want to make sure you understand that these are peer ranks. So We don't put nearly as much weight on these. But look at the rank that we've done for this hypothetical fund. It's 40 the whole way across. Looks boring. I mean, year after year, they are never in the top quartile. Just 40, they're just barely above median. But that consistency, take a look at what happens after 20 years. They're crushing everybody. They're, almost in the top decile again. And this consistency is really important. And the reason why it's so hard to achieve is two things. From behavioral finance, we know that we are all more focused on what most recently happened. It's called the recency effect. So as Paige gave the example, oh man, that fund was really loaded up on Mag 7 and they did really well. Well, that's what we should do too, except that was then, this is now. And number two is that the right way to create a consistent stream of earnings returns over a long period of time? Because Mag 7s come and they go. If you look, for example, at the S&P 500 today and compare it to, say, 1960, a huge number of companies have disappeared from it. So this consistency of approach may sound boring. And boy, your consultant doesn't want to come across as boring, but this is the Zen study that I often refer to, and that is the way to get for in 20 years in the top quartile or even the top decile is to never try to be in it in any one year. So there you have it.
Yeah, this is also incredibly interesting, and especially looking at some of the performance reports. I know they're not a slight thing, well out of what we look at as relative to benchmark, but just thinking about that, because we do, at least relative to the benchmark, what we looked at earlier, kind of the one year, kind of current year to fiscal year to date is below benchmark, and even the performance maybe against peer might not be as good as it looks like over the 10-year period or the since inception period. But really thinking about that, that is the performance you're striving for, is, that percentile, and maintaining that accumulates to what the long-term performance is really is just very interesting. Yeah.
This is my favorite slide that I've pretty much ever seen. I love this slide because it absolutely 100% speaks to our overarching strategy, which is not just me, but a tribute to, those that have come before me, staff, everything else. And it kind of boils down the idea that, we get stuck in the weeds and we show in the performance report each quarter, oh, well, this asset class didn't hit their benchmark, and this sub asset class didn't do this, or it's above that, it's like all of that kind of falls away when you look at this, and this is kind of the summation of it all, and I know it's versus peers, and Jim's exactly right. We don't necessarily care what peers do, but it does kind of get to that summation of like, Jim may not want to be boring. I want to be boring. Being boring in investments is great. It's a great place to be, right? And and it never is boring ultimately, but that's kind of what you're striving for is yeah, we're not, and it makes the point. We're not trying to hit things out of the park all the time. We're not trying to be, hey, crypto's the next greatest thing, or whatever the hot thing is today, which somebody's talking about and wants you to do. It's, we're going to kind of keep doing what we've been doing. We certainly change over time and things morph, but it's kind of a slow ship to turn. And at the end of the day, it works.
Yeah, just by being consistent doesn't mean you'll achieve this. There's a lot of work in being consistent and having a positive result. You guys have done it. But the next 20 years is a new challenge. But the point is that we know for a fact that inconsistent approaches don't work. So that it's one of my favorite slides as well. We talked about trade-offs, more of one risk or getting rid of some risk, maybe more of others. Why don't you finish up, Paige, if you would, with 46 and 47, and we can finish up the investment risk section.
Before you go on, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to tell John, boring is good from my perspective, because managing what we manage for the benefit of the people of Montana does not need to be a roller coaster. That kind of excitement just doesn't do us any good. It doesn't do the people any good. And I think you're doing a great job. So be boring, John.
Thank you, Cindy.
He's succeeding, and like you wouldn't believe too.
Well, he's doing a good job at it. So
So on 46, again, I'm gonna hold up my fancy little drawing here because this is how I view all of these trade-offs again, right? There's going to be a barbell between these trade-offs when we're looking at any of them. And that's really what's underpinning a lot of the decisions you're making when you're building your investment portfolio. So there's inherently going to be tension between having stability of contributions and the level of contributions. And you have to decide which one, and you have a less control over this again because of the way your contribution policy is structured. But I think of it at least as like a personal budget, right? I would always much rather know like how much I'm going to need to pay for my main expenses on an annual basis, than be surprised and maybe have to give way more money or pay way more in electricity, the next year than I
You're
did
as
the
boring
year.
as John.
I know.
Jeez.
No, you don't want to be surprised, right? So stability of contributions is important and helps everyone plan for and be prepared to make that. The second trade-off here, looking at maximum return versus volatility of assets. Again, that goes back to the consistency that we were just talking about. There's always going to be a portfolio out there that probably allows you to potentially maximize your return a little more, right? And it usually involves taking on more risk, but then you need to, again, go back to like, what is the level of volatility or the level of risk that I'm willing to take on in this scenario? And luckily, you're not in a position where you're having to reach and take on way, way, way more volatility than maybe you're comfortable with to try and hit the level of return that you're also looking for. So, but that would go back to the asset allocation study. That's really the main tension that you're looking at. And the trade-offs there is how much risk versus how much unit of return are we comfortable in looking to take on at this point in time. Looking at the key trade-off 3, benchmark return versus potential for outperformance. This is where I kind of look at that active passive decision coming in. And that's more, again, looking at your asset class structures. The research shows, and we have the data to back this up if anyone was ever interested, that historically speaking, there are specific asset classes where managers have been able to outperform the benchmark on a much more consistent basis than other asset classes.
The median manager.
The median manager. And you'll see this reflected in the own structure of your portfolios. If you were to look at US equity, you're entirely passively implemented. That is an area of the market where managers have historically had a hard time outperforming the benchmark. So that's a decision that was made structurally to say, we're gonna match the benchmark and be comfortable getting that market exposure beta return in that asset class. We think it's more worth our time to be active in something like non-core fixed income or the private asset classes, and we're going to dedicate more of our due diligence time and efforts there because we think there's more potential to outperform the benchmarks there. So that's another example, I guess, of the trade-offs within an asset class that are occurring. And then the last point here, manager performance versus desired market exposure performance. I'm actually not sure what that is supposed to mean relative to
This is an example of, I picked managers and I picked them because I thought that they had high potential for outperformance. But I failed to realize that along with higher potential for outperforming also comes higher volatility. And in the case of this particular metric, it's called tracking error. And it means that the manager's performance in some years is going to be really great. Some years it's going to be terrible. High tracking error managers are not necessarily a bad thing, but they represent a big challenge for monitoring, and they represent a big challenge for retention decisions, because their return over 10 years may be great. But the ride that you take, it's the roller coaster that Cindy was talking about, maybe more than you can stomach. I think that's what we're talking about here.
Perfect, thank you, Jim.
John asked a lot of questions about metrics in the private equity arena. Page 47 just is a group of metrics that we've talked about and that you will hear us talk about during asset allocation time, but also on quarterly performance. I mean, I talked about equity beta today. When you see standard deviation, think volatility. They mean roughly the same thing. So anyway, I think that's that. I don't know where we stand, Mr. Chair, in terms of your timing for this, but we think this has been time well spent, and we're geeks about this. So we're in pretty good shape.
Well, some of us may have thought it was boring, but boring's good, I guess. Some
I
was good.
I've got to tone it down then, I guess, is the answer.
No, I think this was definitely, I think it's a good, refresh, and every time you kind of go back through step by step, you pick up kind of a new understanding of what we're looking at. Some of these charts were just, incredibly informing, I think, the ones we pointed to. So I think it was great. I don't know if we have any other specific questions from any board members that they'd like to discuss or ask.
I think there's a number of slides in the appendix after this that explain some of the stuff, the last slide that you just went over in more detail. That's very helpful.
Good.
Okay.
Do you guys have anything else you'd like to cover, or that check the boxes of what you expect?
No, it turns out, John had asked about our contract, that when your predecessors negotiated our continuing contract, which we were very grateful for, by the way. This is, I'm not kidding when I say this is one of our favorite client relationships for sure. But one of the things that you asked us to do was to place an emphasis on agenda specific education. So we've tried to do that in two ways. One is this, and the other is kind of what I tried to do and what Becky and Paige tried to do. Even when we're delivering just quarterly performance, asset allocation, we try to find ways in those presentations, even though their objective may be something other than just education, to find ways to add an opportunity to try to make your ability to make informed decisions better, because that's our job. So that's what we're trying to do. I hope we're succeeding halfway, despite the fact that we're not as boring as John. We're going to aspire to be more boring.
Jim, I'm going to say you're plenty boring enough, so don't worry about it.
Thank you, Cindy.
Well, for those of us that are not stockbrokers and we're not geeks about this, it's it's like speaking Greek, and I'm telling you, there's a reason they say that about Greek, because it is very hard to understand. And this is not my bailiwick, but people that are brokers, and we've got people on the board that know what you're talking about. And I don't have a clue what you're talking about, but you help me understand it enough that I think it's a good explanation, and I think we're doing a good job. So for what that's worth.
Right. Anything else?
I concur, by the way, on that one.
That Jim's boring?
That was an excellent presentation.
Taking shots.
Very helpful, very illuminating.
Yeah, taking shots.
Well, it's funny. About 6 years ago, there was a piece of legislation that was moving, and it was to make all of the members of the Board of Investment financial experts. They had to be financial experts. Now, there are two problems with that. Is there's financial expertise and experience that is very applicable to what you do here in a institutional multi-asset class portfolio. And most people in the financial world, by definition, have narrow specialties. And legislatures have difficulty getting their arms around sort of defining, well, what is a financial expert as it applies to a seat such as the ones you occupy. The other problem is that we have experienced time and time and time again that lay individuals with great common sense, who ask a lot of questions when they're confused about something or they don't think they fully understand it. And they bring wisdom and patience to the table. They can be outstanding trustees. And so we were asked to write a letter about our philosophy, and that's exactly what the letter said.
Now, that piece of legislation did not come from the former executive director's soon-to-be ex-sister-in-law during a really nasty divorce. Oh, wait, it did. You want to go over April?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so April will be remote only, but if you're in town and you want to come in, feel free. We'll be able to stream from in here, so.
When will that?
April 22nd. It's a one-day remote. But again, if you want to come in, feel free. Domestic equity asset class review. So Jason and Steve will be doing their education. Jim will be here for the annual capital market assumptions update. And then the report for the board will have the benchmarks. That memo is due in April, and I'm sure there'll be some questions, but that's all we've got for coming up. May will be a big one.
When is May?
May is May 20th.
I have to tell my wife. Because she wants it on her calendar.
And that'll
She
be
can plan
in
a day
August.
out that way, Mark.
Yeah. or something.
Golfing without you.
So that's what we've got. Anything you all need from me between now and then?
I have a few things. When you meet with LED on the transaction, whatever issues come up, can you let us know?
Yep.
And then on the facility, I don't know what you got out of this meeting today. I don't know what actions you're gonna take. I'm not gonna worry about it, but when you meet with the interim committee, if there's any input there that you want to share with us, that'd be great.
Will do.
And then last item is the remarkables thing. It's not very.
Or as Cindy refers to it, the unremarkable.
It's not
The
very-
unremarkable, remarkable. And I'm bringing mine back to the meeting in May, right? Unless you want me to ship it.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
It's not very useful. It's hard, especially with this material that we have to go through. It's difficult to read. So I tried to use it. I
And if you don't like it, we'd be happy to repurpose it. I know pairing it is a problem. We just want to be able to get you guys the information. The thing what I've been worried about since December is we now have a new level of scrutiny. AI scrapers are going out and pulling anything we put on the website that if it's any information about our managers, loan portfolios, anything like that is getting scraped. So we've got to be extra diligent about how we communicate the information with you guys. Board members get everything, PII and all of it. You have that entrusted to you. We're trying to figure that out. I hope the smart room can get us there, that we can see everything.
I didn't have any trouble with the smart room. It worked fine, and I could read everything way better than on a remarkable.
Right. So if you have suggestions or things we can do better, even going back to paper, happy to do that. I think the concern I'd have with the paper is if you leave it in an airport or if you're at the grocery store and it falls out of your backpack or whatever, we have a problem. So we want to get you the information. Very worried about security at this point.
Seems like obviously everybody here has their own laptop. Yeah, you know, emailing the
smart room
public
was
packet and doing the smart room worked fine for me. I totally agree. Visually, it's a lot easier to follow, you know, on a laptop than the remarkable. So
okay,
that seems to be. I think moving away from the paper packets makes sense. There's, you know, I think this is a better approach, a laptop than going this route. So that's probably what I'll lean towards.
Thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. You know, the information was very well presented. It's a tough thing to go through and sit through. It's boring. We already talked about that.
We appreciate that.
It's very helpful.
We appreciate that. And, you know, you see Paige and Becky and I, but what you don't see is the rest of the team and the people that Paige pointed out behind us. So much of the material that you see here, we've worked with our subject matter experts to put together. And we've actually collaborated on this with your staff as well. So, and we do that all the time. I mean, I think I've made clear that we don't work for John or Dan, but we have to work well with them.
Yeah.
To work well for you.
That's all I have.
Great.
Great.
Appreciate it. So, there's nothing else. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.